Ross Norman there from Metals Daily. Well, some of the amateur investors on Reddit seem to be trying to ensure certain large investors lose quite a lot of money. In their sights are those market players, such as hedge funds, who've bet the price of GameStop and others would fall. Manuela Saragossa has been looking at what motivates them and has been talking to one retail investor.
So my name's Alex Patton. I live in Kingston upon Thames in London. I would say I'm a fairly normal amateur investor in that it's just something I do from time to time ever since, this sort of home trading became popular with the pandemic.
Alex there may be Anglo-American, but he's as far away from a big Wall Street investor as you can get. He trades in his spare time when he's not at his day job in cybersecurity.
Honestly, I'd never traded a stock in my life before the pandemic.
But over the past year, Alex has started checking out a chat on the online community site Reddit, specifically a Reddit thread called Wall Street Bets, where people like him discuss stock investments. And it's on that thread that Alex first heard about an American company called GameStop. It's a struggling bricks-and-mortar video game retailer, losing out as the world moves online. Wall Street investors, hedge funds and the like, don't think it has much of a future. In fact, they've bet billions of dollars that GameStop's shares will fall, an investment strategy known as shorting a stock. But the amateur investors on the Reddit thread Alex is following have taken umbrage to that. They've started buying GameStop shares en masse, effectively betting against Wall Street, and Alex has joined them.
I think it started out as a good investment decision based on market dynamics that hedge funds take advantage of all the time. And as people realized that normal people could take advantage of those dynamics as well in large numbers, it started to transform into more than just an investment. It started to transform into a movement of people from all walks of life, people with no more than maybe a few £100s to their name, being able to put money down on this stock and play the hedge funds at their own game. And I think good on them.
The result has been a surge in the price of GameStop shares, and not just by a bit. They're up a whopping 70% since the start of the year, which means that anyone who shorted the stock, in other words, bet that GameStop shares would fall in price, has lost money. And last week, a small number of hedge funds on Wall Street ran into financial trouble as a result of that Reddit mass buying movement. Amateur investors were psyched. They thought they were succeeding, beating Wall Street at its own game. But then the trading platform most of these amateur investors use, a free broker app called Robinhood, introduced restrictions on trading in GameStop shares, as well as a number of other shares these amateur investors were chasing. Robinhood says those restrictions were necessary because the stocks were too volatile. But the reaction from small Reddit investors on social media has been furious, with much of their anger directed at the Robinhood app. US regulators, the SEC, on Friday said they would review trading curbs imposed by the likes of Robinhood. In the meantime, as we heard, amateur investors say it seems to be one rule for the bigwigs on Wall Street and another rule for them. But is that really what's going on?
I'm Alexis Goldstein. I'm a former Wall Street professional who now advocates for financial regulation.
Alexis says market regulators should take a very close look at who's really behind the price surge in GameStop shares. She reckons it's unlikely it all came from amateur investors.
I have a lot of questions about who added fuel to the fire, who helped this go up faster, what were the major Wall Street players doing, what was their role here, and was there manipulation, again, not from Reddit traders, but from Wall Street itself, who saw this as an opportunity to push the price up even further and then maybe crash the price later. And I hope that regulators are looking not just at the small folks, whether it be individuals or even some of the smaller brokerages. I do think Robinhood has its own issues, and the regulators should certainly look at Robinhood and make sure they're protecting their customers. But I hope that they're looking at the bigger picture and the bigger players too. And I fear, based on history, that might not happen.
And the reason Alexis questions who's really behind the GameStop share surge comes down to the fact that broker apps like Robinhood sell their customers' trading data to big players on Wall Street. In other words, the bigwigs on Wall Street would have known what amateur investors on Reddit were planning all along.
One of the things I learned when I worked on Wall Street is one of the most fiercely guarded secrets is what Wall Street's positions are. So if you're a big bank, you don't want your competitors to know what your positions are, and you pay a lot of money to try and figure out what your competitors' positions are. But there's a real premium placed on knowing what other people are planning to buy and sell. So there is this idea that the folks on Reddit have come together and used Robinhood to, buy up GameStop stock and push it higher. There is nothing, I don't think, that would excite a Wall Street trading desk more than having publicly available free information about what other people, thousands and thousands of other people, are planning on doing.
Alexis Goldstein. Back to our Reddit investor Alex Patton, who still holds GameStop shares. We've got now the White House getting involved. We've got, everyone's got an opinion about it. The SEC's looking into it. There's a class action lawsuit against Robinhood. What would you like to see happen? What do you think would make it a fairer playing field?
Honestly, even though I made some money out of this whole GameStop situation, I don't think it should have happened to begin with. I think the hedge funds should never have been allowed to short GameStop to the extent that they did.
It's been described as a populist revolt, this whole ganging up by retail investors to drive up the price. What do you make of that? I mean, do you resent that tag that you're part of a populist revolt, or do you think that's the right way to look at it?
What I think is there is a huge inequality, absolutely. And if you prevent ordinary people from being able to invest in the market how they wish, then you're creating the opportunity to entrench that inequality. This is about not only people not having money, but people not even having the opportunity to try and make money.
But do you really think you can win against Wall Street in this one?
Maybe, maybe not. But I think, if nothing else, this has sort of uncovered some of the tactics that can be used to frighten retail investors.
Alex Patton there, ending that report by Manuela Saragossa, and that volatility on the stock market continues because GameStop shares are currently down 35%. We can talk to Rachel Winter, Associate Investment Director at Killick & Co. Hi, Rachel.
Hello.
Does all of this make investing more exciting than usual, or just perhaps an awful lot more terrifying?
Well, I think it's both. Obviously, it's quite exciting to see such big moves in share prices, but as someone who is trying to invest for the long term, it does make it more terrifying because historically when investing, we would try and value a company using traditional methods, and it does feel as though some of those methods are now becoming less and less relevant because people are now buying shares for different reasons.
This may, of course, just be a short-lived phenomenon, but if it does go on much longer, speculation on social media, could that be the driving force behind the decisions that you and others make, rather than looking at the fundamental value of a company?
I hope not. I think that would make investing incredibly difficult, and it would mean we would only be looking at momentum in certain shares rather than the underlying fundamentals. So I really hope that doesn't happen. But it does feel as though retail investors are becoming much more involved in the stock market. So I do think that over time, yes, we will have to bear in mind to some extent what those retail investors are doing.
And do you think we're heading towards a moment where perhaps the authorities have to get involved and do something about this?
I think they'll certainly be looking at it. Obviously, with such volatility happening, the authorities will want to have a look and see exactly what's causing that. The question at the moment is whether any regulations are currently being broken. And at the moment, it's not really clear whether or not they are. So I think at first the authorities will have a look and decide what is happening. And only then can they decide whether or not more regulation is needed to try and reduce this level of volatility.
OK, quick look at another story around today. The British online fashion giant ASOS has bought Topshop, Topman, Miss Selfridge from Sir Philip Green's Arcadia Group, which collapsed into administration last year. They're buying the brands, but not the shops. Is this a dark day for the British high street?
I think it will be a sad day for many people, particularly for Topshop fans. That flagship store on Oxford Street was one of the main points of the British high street. But sadly, the reason the companies have failed is that people were no longer shopping enough on the high street. So At least it's a good thing that some of these brands have been kept going.
Rachel Winter, thank you. India has the second highest number of recorded coronavirus infections in the world. And for years, the country's been experiencing a rise in chronic diseases. Yet the government spends the equivalent of just 1% of economic output on healthcare, a figure among the lowest for any major economy. Today, New Delhi tried to rectify that in a budget aimed at creating what the government called wealth and wellness. Well, the BBC's Arunaday Mukherjee is in Delhi. He told me about the economic and pandemic background to India's budget statement.
COVID-19 and the 2-month lockdown last year left the economy completely crippled with a contraction of over 23%. So all focus was on measures the government takes to try and bring the economy back on track. Millions, remember, are still jobless. So to help generate employment, one of the big announcements was that they're boosting manufacturing and trying to increase demand. And for that, the government says it's looking to spend nearly $76 billion on capital expenditure and nearly $27 billion on manufacturing projects. So this will essentially help create jobs, put more money in the hands of people, so then they go and spend more, and that eventually has that cascading effect on the economic cycle of the country. What was also significant is that, as you know, this budget is coming in the backdrop of the 2-month-old farmers' agitation against the new farm laws. There was a lot of anticipation on that front. What kind of a note would the finance minister strike, whether it will be conciliatory or whether she would shed more light on what more measures the government is taking. But the finance minister simply said that the government remained committed to the welfare of farmers and doubling their income. These are some of the aspects that the government undertook in its budget.
With the government announcing it's going to spend huge amounts of extra money on various areas, an awful lot of which will go on health, did the finance minister outline how the government can afford to pay all of this? Will taxes have to rise, for example, or is it largely going to be funded by borrowing? For
the first time, India made healthcare its biggest budget priority. Ordinarily, India spends just over 1% of its trillion-dollar GDP on healthcare, but with India being home to the second highest number of COVID-19 cases in the world, the government has pledged nearly $5 billion towards the COVID vaccination plan. That's one aspect. It also plans to spend over $30 billion to strengthen the overall health infrastructure. The government went on record to say that they will be looking to develop capacities of primary, secondary and tertiary care health systems, strengthen the existing national institutions and create new institutions to cater to detection and cure of new and emerging diseases. One other important aspect that I'd just like to quickly highlight would be the health of India's banking sector, which has also been ailing and piled under heavy debt. So to address that and an ever-increasing number of non-performing assets, the government also proposed a $2.7 billion recapitalization plan for the government banks.
With the government announcing it's going to spend huge amounts of extra money on various areas, an awful lot of which will go on health, did the finance minister outline how the government can afford to pay all of this? Will taxes have to rise, for example, or is it largely going to be funded by borrowing?
It is the latter, in fact, and that is really the million-dollar, and no pun intended, the million-dollar question, really, because the government is on the mat when it comes to its fiscal deficit. So it has very little maneuvering room, really, to try and be very experimental in its ideas. But one aspect that the finance minister laid down was that it was looking to borrow over $160 billion this financial year to meet its expense targets and to reduce the fiscal deficit. To raise more funds, it is also looking to sell its stake in various public sector companies. So that is one aspect. It is also looking to make the most of a lot of government assets in these public sector enterprises, to try and divest government stake in these organizations and try and raise money. As far as the tax slabs are concerned, the government has left that unchanged, so it hopes to rake in some more liquidity by way of taxation as well.
The BBC's Arunaday Mukherjee there. So what do those who work in healthcare make of the government's promise to double the amount it spends on the sector? Shikha Nehru Sharma is a medical doctor and runs the telemedicine service NutriWell. Does she think the finance minister's pledge to spend $30 billion on healthcare is enough?
Primarily, while it may not be enough, it's a good move in the right direction. So we are happy that healthcare finally has started seeing some attention in our country.
When you compare India to other economies, it does spend an incredibly low proportion of its national income on health. Why is that?
I think the priority, as a government, I think they do not prioritize healthcare or education, and the other areas where they feel like, for example, India being a large country doesn't even have enough roadways, or it doesn't have enough power generation, which is required for industries. So when people get elected, somehow the most fundamental things get least attention.
This announcement about healthcare spending being more than doubled comes, of course, in the teeth of the pandemic. So that's clearly the main motivation for the rise in the health budget. But do you think there should be other areas of healthcare which should get a large share of that spending?
Absolutely. So I have a couple of concerns about how this money would be spent. So the first thing is, I feel that, if the money is spent on just building physical infrastructure and not the digital infrastructure, then it will obviously be too short. Secondly, if a lot of this money is just spent on giving COVID vaccine, and we know that we may be spending a lot of money in areas which, if the new virus comes in, it just may not work. The third thing is that corruption is a very old problem in India because of its large infrastructure and lack of transparency. So while the spending has been announced, but how would it be spent? And what would be the priority in terms of local versus national? The next thing, of course, is that one of the biggest problems in India is water quality. So a lot of deaths happen due to lack of good quality water and diseases. So while COVID has been a high priority for the last year, there are far more deaths happening because of poor quality of water and lack of access of healthcare. Even digital access is not available.
You said that you don't want all of the money to be poured into vaccinating people against coronavirus, but surely it's incredibly important to protect the old, the vulnerable against the virus, and also to allow you to restart the economy again once those groups have been vaccinated.
Fundamentally, looking at the population of India, 1 billion plus people, it's almost next to impossible to vaccinate everybody.
Does that mean you shouldn't try?
Whenever there is a mutation, and viruses tend to mutate very fast, many vaccines stop working. And if the entire money is spent on that rather than providing basic clean water so that the immunity is high of the people, then it will be money poured without any outcome.
So you're saying that far fewer people will die of coronavirus in India than will die of other problems which have been around for a number of years?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Dr. Shikhaneru Sharma there, the co-founder of the telemedicine service NutriWell in India. During the pandemic, many people have had a lot more time on their hands. Some old, perhaps forgotten hobbies are making a comeback, including the often painstaking task of completing jigsaw puzzles. Sales of jigsaws have rocketed over the past year. The market research company NPD says the UK has seen a 38% increase on the year before. That is great news for Julie Wilkins, who with her husband runs the jigsaw maker JHG Puzzles in southwest England.
We have been running to stand still, would be my comment. We usually carry what we call stock on the floor, so we normally have stocks of the bulk of the puzzles. But we started to see a big increase in February, March before lockdown, when COVID was in its infancy last year. And we hit lockdown, but it never stopped increasing. And it's been manic since then. I have to say that although I know COVID has hit a lot of businesses very hard, it's been very kind to us in the jigsaw world.
What is it that you think people want to get out of a jigsaw, particularly during the pandemic?
I'm going to be very rude, I suppose, in a funny sort of way. Television doesn't always hold your imagination. There are quite a lot of repeats. It doesn't matter what you watch. You can't always get into a good book, or you haven't got a good book. And I think with jigsaw puzzles, they can be done as a family. You can all sit round and do a bit, no matter whether you're 5 or 50 or whatever. It's quite tactile too. It's a physical thing. You're actually thinking, you're looking at colours, shapes, piece sizes, format. And I think for a lot of people, you're actually doing. You're not just sitting clicking a mouse or staring blankly at a television programme.
It seems like doing jigsaws is now pretty trendy. So what are the most popular images on jigsaws then?
Depends who you are. I sell a lot of nostalgic jigsaw puzzles, like farmyards and street scenes, and I do a lot of what people would call chocolate box cottages and pubs and scenery.
Do you think this is something that will last beyond the pandemic, or do you think it is mainly a pandemic-based distraction when, as you say, there's lots of repeats on the television and the pubs are closed?
I think it will slow down, but I think people have suddenly found something that they enjoyed as children, that they did with Granny, Then life gets in the way. When you're 12 and 13, it's not really the thing to do a puzzle. But as you get a little bit older, you get more time back. And I think it's something that Gran then does with children, and then she thinks, oh, I enjoyed that, and I will go back to doing it. And I think people will have rekindled a love for it. It's always been popular. Jigsaws have always been popular. They were just never the in thing to be talking about, if that's the right word. And I think also in today's world, they're quite a sustainable product. They're made of cardboard and paper. They don't come in cheap plastic, and they do last for years. I've got puzzles in my archive that are 60, 70, 80 years old. I think people will continue to do them. It's been a lovely resurgence, to be honest.
Julie Wilkins there of JHG Puzzles. Well, that is it for this edition of World Business Report. Don't forget our 2 daily podcasts are always available from the BBC website.
This is the BBC World Service, and here's Winifred Robinson to tell you about a new series, Coronavirus Frontline.
We're following a vaccine trial at one of the UK's 5 clinical trial centres.
Welcome to Team Bradford. Thank you for volunteering.
You'll hear from the doctors and the volunteers.
I trust science, I trust the process.
Coronavirus Frontline, the search for a vaccine. Tuesday at 9:20 GMT. And at bbcworldservice.com, Heart and Soul.
Can recycling old computer parts really lead to successful reintegration? Join me, Colm Flynn, as I meet former prison inmates in the United States who believe it can.
Stay with us, OS is next, here on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello and welcome to OS with Nuala McGovern live from London. And here on the BBC World Service, we are working to understand the story that continues to develop in Myanmar. We know there has been a military coup in the country and that Aung San Suu Kyi and other democratically elected leaders have been detained. But it is a country with a complex political history, so we need to explain some of the recent years in Burmese politics. And we also want to ask our guests, what does it mean to the citizens that the military has now taken control of the country? You're going to hear from an activist in Yangon, the largest city in Myanmar, and also from those who left the country but are now trying to understand what is happening from afar. One mentions a sense of déjà vu with Ms. Suu Kyi's detention. They also describe their fears for their relatives, who they say have locked themselves into their homes to try and stay safe. First, this news.
BBC News, hello, I'm Gareth Barlow. The Burmese army is tightening its grip over Myanmar after seizing power in a coup. The military-run TV station has announced the appointment of new ministers to replace those ousted from power. Myanmar's civilian leaders, including Aung San Suu Kyi, have been detained. Nyan Chanai of the BBC's Burmese service is in Yangon.
There are some groups who call themselves as nationalists celebrating military seizing power, but the mood as well was filled with fear, anger, and frustration. People have been seen lining up at ATMs and banks and trying to take out money as much as they can. Phone lines and internet connection is limited. The military detained some of the key pro-democracy activists earlier today, so that there is unlikely that we will immediately see anti-junta protests here in Yangon or anywhere else in the country.
There's been wide-scale international condemnation of the Burmese military. The United Nations Security Council is reportedly planning to hold an emergency meeting on Tuesday to discuss the coup. The most senior Republican in the US Senate, Mitch McConnell, described the detention of civilian leaders as horrifying. The social media platform Twitter has blocked dozens of Indian accounts in response to a legal notice filed by the Indian government, citing objections based on public order. Here's Jill McGivering.
The blocked accounts are all linked to the continuing farmers' protests against a series of agricultural reform laws. They include farmers' leaders, activists and a news magazine sympathetic to the cause. Government officials say they highlighted in their submission to Twitter about 250 accounts and tweets which they said constituted a threat to public security. The protests are now in their third month, with many farmers camped on the outskirts of the capital. Last week, a tractor rally through Delhi led to clashes with police and some protesters storming the historic Red Fort.
The United States has said that Iran could be only weeks away from having enough material for a nuclear bomb if it keeps lifting restraints on its atomic program. The assessment was made by the new Secretary of State for the United States, Antony Blinken. With more details, our Middle East analyst Alan Johnson has this report.
He said that if Iran pressed ahead, it might be just a matter of weeks before it had enough of the material needed to sustain a nuclear chain reaction in an atomic bomb. Iran agreed to rein in its nuclear program under an international accord struck in 2015, but President Trump tore up that deal. In retaliation, the Iranians have been breaching commitments they made in the agreement and reinvigorating their nuclear program. The Biden administration wants both sides to return to the 2015 accord.
World news from the BBC. French lawmakers have begun debating a draft law to counter radicalisation, with critics imploring them not to make Islam the scapegoat. The bill to nurture respect for Republican principles is seen as one of President Emmanuel Macron's last big projects. It will discourage homeschooling and boost powers to close private schools that foster radicalism. The wife of the Russian opposition activist Alexei Navalny says she'll appeal against a fine imposed for joining nationwide protests in support of him. Yulia Navalny's lawyer said the court had not published its reason for fining her $260. She was among those detained near the Moscow prison where her husband is being held. A leading humanitarian aid official, Jan Egeland, has criticised the Ethiopian authorities for restricting access to victims of the conflict in the northern Tigray region. He said aid agencies have not been able to reach central and western parts of the region, as well as 2 refugee camps. Our Africa regional editor, Will Ross, has this report.
In a blunt statement, Jan Egeland said aid was still not getting to where it's needed in Ethiopia. The head of the Norwegian Refugee Agency said in all his 40 years in the aid sector, he'd rarely seen a humanitarian response impeded so much. That's quite an assessment from the man who visited many war zones during his years as the UN's relief coordinator. Mr. Egeland said the entire aid sector must also recognise its failure to define the scale of the crisis and to speak out. The Ethiopian government has so far batted away all criticism and has refused to allow an independent investigation into allegations of human rights abuses.
The British government has announced sanctions against 4 Zimbabwean security officials, accusing them of human rights abuses, including killing protesters. The State Security Minister, Owen Nube, as well as the heads of police, the intelligence agency and the former chief of the Presidential Guard, will have any assets in Britain frozen. They'll also be banned from visiting. Live from London, that's the latest. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to OS from the BBC World Service. I'm Nuala McGovern, and each day here we bring you the latest lines on coronavirus and COVID-19 and try to put some context around them to give you answers. So we've quite a few to catch up on today with our medical expert, Dr. Eleanor Murray. She's from Boston University. Vaccines. Yeah, they continue to be one of the topics that we all want to know more about. So we're going to hear more about the AstraZeneca jab and over 65s. Maybe you heard there's been a bit of discussion on that one. Dr. Ellie will help us out. Also, just hearing about door-to-door testing in the UK. This is due to the discovery of the South African variant of the virus in this part of the world where I'm speaking to you from. So more on those issues and others that you've raised as well in about 15 minutes' time here on OS. But let me turn to a story. If you've been with the World Service today, you've probably been hearing some about this story. We continue to piece it together in Myanmar, and it's the story of a military coup. So the military has seized power after detaining democratically elected leaders, and that includes Aung San Suu Kyi. Troops have been patrolling streets in major cities, communications are limited, and a 1-year state of emergency was announced on the military-owned Mayawati television. Here's some of the statement read out by a newsreader who said all authority had been given to the top military commander in response to election fraud.
မဲစင်းများစစ်ဆေးအတည်ပြုခြင်းအပါအဝင်လိုအပ်သည့် In order to perform scrutiny of the voter lists and to take action, the authority of the nation's lawmaking, governance and jurisdiction is handed over to the Commander-in-Chief in accordance with the 2008 Constitution Article 418, Sub-Article A.
So Aung San Suu Kyi's party won the recent election by a landslide, but the army claims there was fraud. Here's that newsreader again with our translation.
A refusal to settle the issue of voter list fraud and a failure to take action and follow a request to postpone lower house and upper house parliament sessions is not in accordance with Article 417 of the 2018 Constitution that refers to acts or attempts to take over the sovereignty of the Union by wrongful forcible means, and could lead to a disintegration of national solidarity.
It is tricky to hear the voices of people who are actually there because of a communications blackout. But here's David Gum-Ang, who works for the international NGO, which is based in the capital city of Naypyidaw, in a video that he posted online.
We are still in disbelief that this happened. And honestly, we really don't know where this coup will lead us to. For me personally, it was my worst nightmare unfolding right before my eyes. The atmosphere in Naypyidaw is eerily calm, as if we're awaiting the arrival of an imminent storm. The streets are empty as usual, and the few people you see in the street, you can obviously tell from the look on their faces that something awful just happened this morning. Army trucks can be seen here and there.
So that is a little there from David Gum-Ang. But there has been and continues to be a strong international condemnation of events. The UN has a representative looking in particular at human rights in the country, and he is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Myanmar, called Tom Andrews, and said the news was an assault on democracy and an assault on a people.
It's just outrageous. It's deeply disturbing. We're still getting information from Myanmar. The communication lines have been cut, so there's a lot that we don't know. But what we do know is that democracy has been overturned by the generals. Many people are now in detention. The Constitution that the generals wrote, and that they pledged just 48 hours ago to fully abide by, has now been overturned. The international community rejects what has happened. That leaders of the world are united in their revulsion of this illegal act, and that the international community is committed to working together to see that this does not stand. The people of Myanmar need to know, first and foremost, that the world is watching and that the world is with them. They are not forgotten, and they're not being forgotten.
So that's UN Representative Tom Andrews. Well, we're going to hear in a couple of minutes' time from some people who are really monitoring these events very closely. But before we go to those two people, I want to bring you a few things you might want to know about the country to help you understand this story better.
Myanmar is in Southeast Asia between Bangladesh, India, China, Laos and Thailand. It was under British rule for 6 decades, regaining independence in 1948. It's also known as Burma. Military rulers changed its official name to Myanmar in the 1980s, partly to break with that colonial past. Since independence, the military has mostly been in charge, and that's where Aung San Suu Kyi comes in. She's the political leader who led the campaign to change things. Her dad was a hero of the independence movement, assassinated when she was a child, and as she argued for democracy, she was put under house arrest for many years. She got the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts. Gradually, the military gave in to change. Aung San Suu Kyi's party won a huge victory in an election in 2015. She wasn't allowed to officially become president, though. She was blocked by a technicality in the constitution because her children, with her British husband, hold foreign passports. That's why she's often described in the news as
the de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi.
The country's de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi.
In other words, although she didn't have the job title of president, she was really the one in charge. Aung San Suu Kyi's international reputation was damaged by the treatment of a Muslim minority group in Myanmar, the Rohingyas. After militant attacks on police stations in 2017, the army responded by attacking Rohingya villages. Hundreds of thousands fled to Bangladesh. Myanmar's government rejected accusations from UN investigators of indiscriminate killings, gang rapes and the burning of villages, which could be considered genocide. Aung San Suu Kyi was accused of doing nothing to stop atrocities. She personally defended the army's actions at a court hearing in The Hague.
Thanks very much to Ben James for that explanation of recent events. And we wanted to hear from the Burmese diaspora, so family from Myanmar but had left the country, to see how are they following developments that are happening. And I got to speak to a couple of people just before I came on air with you. Adnan is 20 and lives in India. His parents fled Myanmar in the 1980s. Min is 24, living in Washington, D.C., and his family moved to the States from Myanmar in 1994.
These past 24 hours for me have been kind of just on the edge. Last night when I got the news of the coup, I was just panicking. I was, telling my mom, it's like, hey, can we call them? Can we talk to them? Can we contact them? Like, what's happening? What's happening? I've just been afraid for my family for a bit now.
Is any information coming through, Min? Are you able to get in touch with anyone?
Well, actually, beforehand, not too long ago, I would say like an hour or so, my aunt did call my mom via phone. I believe, I'm not sure what app they used, but apparently they do have phone lines up for now. Internet usage is still down over there, but I think for now phones are okay. I haven't been able to contact them. As far as I know, and this is from even a few days ago, they've been hiding in their homes, just kind of afraid of, stepping outside with the military kind of running amok. I wanted to talk to my mom. She showed me this Facebook. It was a Facebook live video of someone kind of driving around the streets of Rangoon, sort of commentating that there was just basically, it's barren.
Did they have any inclination that something like this might happen?
Considering that they were hiding for a few days now, I think that's what I wondered.
When you said that, yeah.
Yeah, because that's my guess, is that possibly this was something that people in the country knew about, and now that the ball's rolling, we're like how long has this been going on? Like that again, I'm not sure. I don't know the full details on what was happening around that time. But considering that I got the news last night, and then my mother telling me that just a couple days prior that they were hiding from the military, I don't know what happened between then and now that we're just getting the news now that all this is happening.
Let's hear what we can from Adnan Min as well, and let's hear what he is hearing, if anything, from relatives. Hey, Adnan.
Yeah, hello. And to go back to Min's point about the citizens of Myanmar having prior information to what was going to happen, I think the people in Myanmar did have an idea of what was going to happen, because a week earlier, everyone was panicking. There were rumors of a coup going, but nobody took it seriously, as in nobody thought this was going to happen, but now it did.
That is Adnan and Min. Do stay with us on OS. We're going to play a longer version of the conversation. I found it pretty fascinating. Also the fact that Min's auntie was able to call his mum, and that was just before we came on air, so, about an hour and a half ago or so. And we're going to bring you more details on that story throughout the programme. This is OS on the BBC with Nuala McGovern. We are live from London. I want to bring you a few other stories now briefly being worked on in the BBC newsrooms. An Anglo-Saxon graveyard described as having huge potential has been unearthed beneath former university student housing in England. It's in King's College, Cambridge. They discovered this extensive cemetery containing more than 60 graves. This was after demolishing a group of 1930s buildings, and there's evidence of Iron Age structures and Roman earthworks also identified. The price of silver has hit an 8-year high on Monday. This is amid social media calls to buy the metal and emulate the trading frenzy that we talked about last week that was surrounding the US games retailer GameStop. And to the jazz music legend Tony Bennett, it has been revealed he's living with Alzheimer's disease over the last 4 years. The singer, who's 94, is, according to his wife Susan, not always sure where he is or what is happening around him. However, Mr. Bennett has so far been spared many of the worst characteristics of the disease. Okay, we have a lot to get through, so let me get down to it with Dr. Eleanor Murray, Assistant Professor of Epidemiology at Boston University School of Public Health. Good to have you back with us, Dr. Ellie.
Good to be here.
Right, let us get into some of our coronavirus developments. Maybe we'll turn to vaccinations in Europe first. There was this contentious discussion, I'll call it, between the EU and AstraZeneca over supplies of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine over the weekend. An additional 9 million doses promised, we're hearing of late. But still, discussion about whether those over 65 will get it. We were reporting that in Germany it has not been recommended. The French President Emmanuel Macron, a lot of people following this over the weekend, was dismissive of its effectiveness for older people. Yet older people in the UK are getting it in large numbers. Then over the past hour or so, I saw the Polish government saying they would not be giving it to their older citizens. So how do you see this picture? Is it possible to know who's right?
So I think that this is one of those cases where, there's a little bit of a confusion between sort of how the scientists are talking about it and how people are interpreting that. The question about how well it might work in older adults arises from the fact that in the trial, older adults were enrolled a little bit later. So when the original trial results were published, they said, we don't quite have enough information yet on older adults to give you a specific number for how well it works in older adults. And so a lot of people then kind of, interpreted that and sort of through the, telephone game of the way these things are talked about, that became, there's no evidence that it works in older adults. And then that became, it doesn't work in older adults. And so, I think we're still waiting for, some final numbers specific to older adults, but there wasn't an indication that it wasn't working well in this group. So, it's just one of those things where there's a little bit of a delay on the information, and that delay is being filled with a lot of concern about, why don't we know yet?
Just as you're speaking to me, Dr. Ellie, in comes the figures for the UK showing 9,296,367 people have received the first dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. And most of those will be over the age of 65. Some will be healthcare workers that are younger, of course, but they will have a good old sample to work from. I mean, does it take long to figure out the real world usage and the antibodies that would be, for example, created from people having that first dose?
So from understanding from the real world, the tricky thing here is that there's no sort of placebo group to compare that to. But with 9 million people being vaccinated, and hopefully that number's still going up, we do expect in a lot of countries to start seeing the impact of that on the cases that are circulating in the community now. Especially on the hospitalizations and deaths, because those more severe outcomes are really what the vaccines are trying to prevent.
Yes, yeah. And then places like Poland or Germany just saying, you know what, we're not going to do that right now. What do you think of that approach? They may say that, that they feel the need to be cautious to that level.
Yeah, I think that this is a case where, when we don't yet have a scientific answer, there's not really a clear reason why, policymakers should make one decision or another. And so there are a lot of things to kind of factor in. There are other groups who are, high risk that could be prioritized, where we do have an answer from the trial that it works well for them. And so, healthcare workers and essential workers could be prioritized, and that could help bring down infection rates in the whole country too. So, I think that those are sort of, valid decisions to make at a policy level. But I think that, just important that individuals don't take that and say, oh, because of this, I personally am concerned to get this vaccine for these reasons. It's more just, we're still working through getting all of the information that we need, and not that there's troubling signals.
Yes, and I probably should underline as well, when it comes to Germany, it was a recommendation by the experts to the authorities. So, the one thing we know with COVID is that the path often changes with many twists and turns. Speaking of twists and turns, let's talk variants. So a development here just over the past few hours, really, in the UK, more details coming through, that the variant first detected in South Africa, that they now believe that there are cases here in the UK, particularly down around the London area. And some of the cases, I think it was 11 cases that they found with no other links to travel, etc. So I suppose community cases, as they would call them. And they're going to do door-to-door testing. That's the first time I've heard that term used, Dr. Ellie. But how do you understand it, and why would they need to do that?
So I think that it's interesting that they're going to use door-to-door testing for the variants. I would assume, based on the name, although I don't know quite what their plan is, but I assume that is as it sounds, that they'll be going, out into the neighborhoods and asking people to give samples so that they can test them, so they can track what's going on and find out how much of this variant is in the community. And, it's not really clear that the variant is necessarily that much more severe that it would need this, but just from a general pandemic response perspective, this is actually a great amount of information to get. And it's the kind of thing that would have been nice to have governments doing, almost from the beginning, so that, a door-to-door survey will help us understand how much virus is out there, what types of variants are out there. And that kind of information is really invaluable for figuring out how to target responses the best that we can.
And so what could you do then if, I suppose, for example, the so-called South African variant, which has concerned some of my medical experts in the sense of, a lot is unknown, but, down the line, will all vaccines be as effective against it? I think we just don't know, I think is what I've heard so far. So what would you do in response?
Yeah, so I think, there is definitely some concern that some of the vaccines may not be as effective against the South Africa variant, although it's very much one of those, a small amount of information, and we don't really know enough to make a conclusion yet, but enough to look into it for sure. But I think, that because of that, it is important to know how much of that variant is, happening in the community. If it's a pretty sort of small area where that variant is, then maybe some more stringent lockdowns for that area could help contain the variant and stop it from spreading more widely. If it's a particular, community of individuals, or if it's a particular workplace or something that it's connected to, those things can be really helpful in using those other methods, the public health methods of quarantine and lockdown and masking that can work if we apply them stringently. So knowing where the variant is can be really important from that perspective too.
And I've just got a note here that they believe they're sending the test perhaps direct to people's homes rather than knocking on doors. But I wonder about that, because what I have read about contact tracing is that if there's a human involved, sometimes the other human responds better.
Yeah, when we're doing contact tracing, really that sort of personal connection can be really vital. This is slightly different than contact tracing, where presumably they're not necessarily asking for a whole lot of information up front about where people have been going and what they've been doing. They're just asking for a nasal swab or maybe a spit in a tube, depending on which kind of test it is. And so, the mailing could be okay, but what we do see, a lot of times is that when you mail out sample collection kits to people, you get only a small percentage back. So hopefully they'll be doing some follow-up to encourage return of those tests.
Let me just turn briefly to India. A report over the weekend says that they could have antibodies in nearly 25% of Indians. That survey not made public yet. Is that near herd immunity? And I've only got about less than a minute left.
So the best guesses for herd immunity are 60, 70, maybe even 80% of people would have to be, yeah. So,
gosh, because 25% seemed high to me, but maybe it's not.
Yeah, and this is why we don't want to achieve herd immunity through disease, because that is just a huge number of people being sick and potentially having complications. Whereas with vaccination, the vaccines are very safe, and so we can get to 60, 70, 80% without, a lot of hospitalizations and long-term complications and deaths and things. And so that's why vaccines are so important.
Dr. Eleanor Murray, wonderful having you on. Thank you so much for answering our questions. Assistant Professor of Epidemiology at Boston University School of Public Health. Don't know if that snowstorm that's on part of the East Coast is going to get you if it does stay warm. Dr. Ellie, thanks for speaking to us.
This is the BBC World Service. Is our world really changing?
5 years ago, the United Nations announced a 17-step plan to change the world. So we are traveling to 17 countries, meeting 17 17-year-olds.
My name is Victorine. Habari Kenya. That's a greeting in my national language, Swahili.
This week, we are with Victorine in Kenya, looking at goal number 3, good health and well-being.
The first sign I experienced was just a headache. Then all of a sudden I began losing weight.
Hundreds of thousands of children around the world die from malaria each year.
And I have seen my parents suffer malaria, teachers in school, even my dad's colleagues, everyone around me. There's no one who I haven't seen having malaria.
How is her community dealing with this disease? And can the United Nations goal be met?
Project 17. Wednesday at 13:30 and 23:30 GMT.
Welcome to OS from the BBC World Service. I'm Nuala McGovern. Thousands of Russians have come out in the freezing cold over the past 2 weekends to join demonstrations over the jailing of opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Many, the bigger call is about change for them. They are tired of President Putin. And I've been speaking to two of the people who went out to protest this weekend. They'll explain why they risked confrontation with the Russian security forces.
BBC News with Gareth Barlow. A curfew has been announced and troops are on the streets of Naypyidaw, the capital of Myanmar, and the biggest city, Yangon, the day after a military coup. The Burmese army is tightening its grip after detaining civilian leaders, including Aung San Suu Kyi. A military-run TV station has announced the appointment of new ministers. Many in Myanmar have expressed anger at the military takeover. There's been widespread international condemnation of the coup. The UN Security Council is reportedly planning to hold an emergency meeting on Tuesday to discuss it. The United States, the European Union, Japan and India demanded a return to democracy. Bangladesh says it expects to continue negotiations with Myanmar about the repatriation of more than 1 million Rohingya refugees. The United States has warned that Iran could be only weeks away from having enough material to make a nuclear bomb. Iran lifted restraints on its atomic program after Donald Trump pulled out of an international nuclear agreement with Iran. The Biden administration has indicated that it's ready to negotiate a return to the accord. Kosovo has become the latest Muslim country to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. It has also recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. A leading international aid official, Jan Egeland, says restrictions placed on humanitarian efforts in Ethiopia's Tigray region are among the worst he's seen in a 40-year career. He also said the international community was failing in its duty to reach millions of desperate people. Twitter has blocked dozens of Indian accounts in response to a legal notice filed by the Indian government. The accounts are linked to supporters of the continuing farmers' protest against agricultural reforms. And the European Union's law enforcement agency has warned that criminals are selling fake COVID-19 test certificates to allow travellers to avoid restrictions. Europol says it has information about a number of incidents across Europe. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to OS from the BBC World Service. I'm Nuala McGovern. Were you with me last week when we were talking about GameStop? About how people had got together to try and upset the markets. It was called a trading frenzy. GameStop was so last week. Now it's about silver, apparently after reaching an 8-year high. So a bit of an investor battle taking place there. If you weren't following the GameStop story, don't worry. We're going to explain that and also the latest on what's happening with silver right now coming up this half hour on OS. And we'll have Michelle Fleury back with us, who followed GameStop and now is on the silver beat, shall we call it. Right, it's 33 minutes past the hour. Let us turn to Russia. Over the weekend, you might have seen this, there were thousands of Russians that took part in unauthorised protests to demand the release of the jailed opposition leader Alexei Navalny. We've spoken about him many times. He was jailed on his return to Russia after recovering from an attempt to kill him with a nerve agent. He blames the security services for that attack. The Kremlin denies that allegation. Now, there were more than 5,000 people that were detained with these protests. That's according to one of the monitoring groups. In Moscow, police closed metro stations and blocked off the city centre. Maria Kiselyova from BBC Russian was on the streets of St. Petersburg during the protests. Take us there, Maria. Explain what you saw.
Hello. Yes, the Sunday morning for us just started with a change of plans because we had planned to start our reporting on the Nevsky Prospect, which is in the very center of St. Petersburg. And this is where the so-called unauthorized meeting was supposed to start. But when we went out of the metro 2 hours before the rally, the whole Nevsky, which is practically the main street of the city, was blocked. The road was blocked from the pavement with the metal fences. And more than that, the streets that lead to Nevsky were blocked completely with the trucks and buses standing across the roads. So half an hour before the meeting, the protesters' Telegram channel said that there is a new meeting point. We rushed there, and it's a square in front of the youth theatre, and there was a big crowd already. I think several hundred people. It was growing, and there was a lot of police and National Guard officers and special ammunition. Arrests started almost right away. Some of them looked quite harsh, and the crowd fled to a small garden nearby. Police kept arresting people, and in some cases, I saw that the protesters were trying to fight for those who were detained to help them escape. Some of them were successful, but mostly just provoked more violence. Some of the most common backlash from the protesters, and I mean the main one, was throwing snowballs at the police, actually. It was just the beginning. The protesters then split into several columns, and for the next 3 hours, they were moving from square to square before they ended up in their original place. Mostly people just moved with the crowd, but some instructions also appeared in Navalny's headquarters Telegram channel. And it looked like the police just didn't have enough capacity to stop all these large groups. But of course, the arrests were going on and on. The most frightening, the most severe part, for me at least, it was of this rally was when protesters gathered in front of the St. Petersburg Parliament. They were standing on the porch of the building, chanting down with the Tsar, or Putin should resign, and other things. And at some point, the police was pushing quite hard, for example, in the lane near the Parliament building. And it was there when I heard the sound of the firecracker. And I think that we were all lucky that it didn't provoke any kind of panic or conjunction. But to me, it looked very possible at that point.
I understand. So you bring us kind of the tension that was there. But you mentioned Mr. Navalny. I mentioned a little bit about him as I introduced. But how significant is he as a figure, do you think, for those people that were out protesting? Why is he important?
To me, actually, it seemed that the motives of the protesters were not purely political. It would not be right to say that they are all just supporters of Alexei Navalny. First of all, many people are afraid of being charged with extremism. And when you ask them, they just say, well, I was curious, or I just came for a walk here. But those who do speak about their motives say that they're tired of lies, for example, or they had come to the rally a week before and now came to protest the police violence. Or to show that they are not afraid. So it's, again, kind of a backlash. Of course, many people mention the film that Alexei Navalny's team issued about the palace in the south of Russia, which reportedly is used by Vladimir Putin. But it's not. It's not the main thing that people mention. Also, for some young people, it is a kind of fun, a weird kind of fun, because I saw some funny costumes. Some of them are playing music in the loudspeakers, but music politically motivated hits, and they are taking selfies with a line of National Guard officers. So it seems to me that it's a kind of weird fun, or I don't know, sport to them.
I think that line, a weird kind of fun. Maria Kiselyova, thank you so much. You very much did take us to St. Petersburg and to what you experienced. Also really interesting to hear your take on why some people were there. I want to bring another couple of takes on that. Just before we came on air, I got to speak to a couple of people instead in the city of Moscow. We're not using their real names for their own safety. We're calling them Anna and Alexei. They both took part in the protests. I wanted to find out why, and Alexei spoke first.
Now I'm going because of the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, because the case that they opened to jail him, and because they made such strong, violent moves against the protesters.
And let me bring Anna in. Tell me a little bit about your reason for going to the streets.
I got reasons to go on the protests. Most of them are because I'm against political persecution, and I agree with Alexei. All this violent stuff they do with common people as we are. We don't do anything violent for them, but they do this for us, and it's inappropriate.
Would you have called yourself a supporter of Alexei Navalny before this?
Yeah, I think I'm a long-time supporter. I helped him when he made his first move with trying to go for be a mayor of Moscow in 2012. So yeah, I will say I'm a long-time supporter.
And what about you, Anna?
I like him as a person, as a TikToker, as a YouTuber, and also I like his political program. He made trying to become a president of Russia in 2018. But I like him as the hope Russian young people and even just all Russian people have, because we are so much tired of this government.
But do you think that with these protests that there could even be a real difference in the country, Alexei?
I believe that the peaceful protest is a very difficult and very timely process. So I think that it's not about this year or next year maybe, but I believe that every mistake that our government makes and every big event that opposition organizing is moving us tighter to the goal.
Anna, what would you think about that?
Yeah, I think that peaceful protests, they make sense, yes.
What about the protests yesterday? How would you describe what it was like to be there? Anna?
It was like I felt myself in the middle of some revolution, I made a video message to my friends like, guys, I'm in the middle of this. But it was a really emotional moment. Honestly, it was really a lot of violence and cruelty around me. All the young guys were packed to Afterzags, and I was like standing in the middle of cross streets, and it was all the house happening, and I was like standing, and okay, the main thing I can do is not to feel fear, and so it's my aim for today.
But was that difficult to not be afraid?
It's the thing that you change inside yourself, and it's my belief that it changes everything the rest.
What do you think, Alexei? Are you ever afraid when you're out there? Because, they talked about unprecedented security measures. We've all seen the videos of people being detained and taken away. And, oh my goodness, it looked so cold. I mean, quite difficult to stand your ground, I would imagine.
I would say I was surprised that people weren't frightened. Like, people knew that they will go and the police will try to stop them, that they would try to beat them and tease them. But I thought that the crowd overall was relentless, and I felt decisiveness in people. Like, they knew why they going out to the street. They knew that this is the real reason. It's not like the prices are high or, I don't know, the taxes are high, but that was the real reason, because just the things that came to Russia, the unprecedented measure of pressure with Alexei Navalny, with his poisoning, with the jail, the world colored in black and white. Like, this is the right ones, and this is the wrong ones. And so when people saw a lot of photos of police brutality, they just know who's right and who's wrong, and that's the point that made the decision for all of us.
Gosh, that's very interesting because, yes, we do cover protests so much, and a lot of the times when people go out on the street, it is something within their day-to-day life which is at breaking point. I don't know, that they cannot get a job, for example. We were hearing that in Tunisia, or maybe it starts with the price of bread in other protests that we start with, or, I don't know, petrol or gas for the car. But with this, you're talking about the actual political structure within the country?
Yeah, I believe that Alexei Navalny did a very strong political and moral deed. Like, I don't know any other examples in modern history. One person was in another country. He knew that when he will go to his own country, he will be jailed, or maybe he will be killed. Possibly he will be killed. Mm-hmm. And then he made it anyway. Like, that's the thing that people can't ignore.
He seemed so brave, and this braveness inspired people. People are so hopeful. I think that people I saw yesterday and the week before, they are so hopeful. They are not afraid.
Alexei, what would you like to add?
Alexei just said, don't fear, and do what you think that is right. And I believe his example, exalted a lot of people. It made a very big difference because we were scared.
Did you come in contact, either of you, with the security forces? I'm just wondering what that was like.
I would say that I didn't, because it was my position, my principal position. I think the process should be 100% peaceful. And so when I saw special forces, I just go a bit far from there.
Yeah, I stood near them most of the time. When you stand on Tverskaya a week ago, you just stand face to face with them. But I didn't act aggressive. I just stood, and maybe they pushed me away if the crowd was too big or something like that. But nothing really aggressive.
A Kremlin spokesperson has denounced the protests as illegal and says there were hooligans among the crowd. And there's been, I think, over 5,000 people arrested who turned out. I mean, tomorrow is a big day. A court in Moscow will decide whether Mr. Navalny will be imprisoned for breaking the terms of a previous suspended sentence, as they say, the Russian authorities he was serving for fraud. What do you think happens, Alexei?
I wish he will be freed, and so our first goal will be achieved, and we can go further in political, to solve this crisis in political way. Honestly, I don't believe they will free him. So I'm afraid there would be the continuation of this movement, of the protests.
And what is it you want ultimately?
To break the regime, I believe, to change it, to make Putin's go away, to make independent judges, to be a normal, not authoritarian country, after all.
And you think the vision that you have of that government in the future, you think that's possible in the coming years?
Yeah, I believe it's totally possible because you can see that in 2010, when there were big protests in Moscow, they were sanctioned events, and there were only 100 people on the streets. And now, all over the country, there are a lot of events. So, country is rising. Peaceful protests made their way a bit slowly, but I believe it's the only way peaceful protests can go. It's not a revolution, it's evolution, after all.
Anna, what would you respond to the same question?
In this question, I'm really depressive. My point of view is like I'm not really hopeful about happy ending, but at the same time, I think that peaceful protests, they make sense because it's the only way for us, for just people, to show that we are not agree, to show that we need changes, to say it, and like we shouldn't stop with this. We shouldn't sit home and feel fear and all of this. We should go, we should say, we should go with huge crowds as it was yesterday, and to say we are not agree with that.
Are you looking for the same outcome as Alexei outlines? The removal of President Putin, for example, and a change in government?
Yeah, I want changes, yeah. I really agree with Alexei. I want normal judges, the reduction of political persecution and like all this. Sorry if I can't find words because I feel really emotional about all this topic.
Tell me a little bit more about those emotions. What are they that you're feeling?
It's some kind of frustration because now I almost feel tears in my eyes because, like, I don't know, like, people are ready for the changes, but some rich and powerful guys on the top of the government, they don't want these changes and they don't want to lose what they have. That's why they want to poison all the country, all the people, and think only about themselves. It's not okay. We are not agree with that. We want good people. I don't know, like maybe more talented people, more young people. We want them to rule the country. We want them to make decisions. We want clever, smart, intelligent people to rule our country, not only like people who steal things.
The Kremlin would deny any allegations of poisoning, of course.
More and more people slowly understand that there's no other way but to become a successful country. And this will come to an end one way or another, in 1 year, in 2 years, in 10 years. I don't know. I wouldn't make a guess, but the sooner the better.
Anna and Alexei, not their real names. They wanted to remain anonymous for their safety, but thanks so much to them for sharing their experiences. Nuala McGovern with you on OS from the BBC World Service. We're live from London. Let's take a look now at some stories briefly being worked on by my colleagues. The teenage leader of a neo-Nazi group has become the youngest person in the UK to have committed a terrorist offence. The boy from Cornwall had admitted to 12 offences. The sentencing hearing of the now 16-year-old will continue on the 8th of February. Let me turn to a Swedish nurse who has won a competition to watch the entire 60-movie programme of the Gothenburg Film Festival from a lighthouse on an isolated island off the coast of Sweden. Lisa Enroth beat 12,000 film fans from around the world who also applied. Festival organisers had been forced to curtail the festival by the pandemic. Let me turn to comedian Eddie Izzard has completed her 31-day virtual marathon run by raising over $300,000 for charity. Speaking from her treadmill after Sunday's double marathon, she said she felt very honoured by the support. The live-streamed runs were held across different virtual cities as part of Izzard's Make Humanity Great Again Goodwill initiative. Right, let's get sports headlines. Nick Hatton's here. Hey, Nick.
Hi there. The FIFA president Gianni Infantino says that World Cup matches will play to full stadiums in Qatar next year. He was speaking virtually at a World Health Organization conference where it was revealed that FIFA will be joining the campaign for fair access to COVID-19 vaccines, treatments and diagnostics. Well, Infantino revealed that he was very, very confident the World Cup will be incredible and will have the same magic united the world. He says we will be back to where we have to be. He also revealed that World Cup players were not a priority group for vaccines against COVID-19. Well, it's transfer deadline day. It's not turning out to be a classic there across the English Premier League with few deals of any note. Not much expected ahead of the 23 GMT deadline either. Liverpool manager Jurgen Klopp may sign a second central defender after sealing a deal for the Preston North End defender Ben Davies. Marseille's Duje Chaletakar and Schalke's Ozan Kabak are potential targets. Manchester United manager Ole Gunnar Solskjaer has ruled out any incomings, while Brighton, though, have been doing some business. They brought in the exciting Ecuadorian talent Moises Caicedo from Independiente. The 19-year-old arrives on a deal until 2025, having won last year's under-20 Copa Libertadores, while Newcastle are in talks with Arsenal to sign Joe Willock, while midfielder Oke Yukuzlu has passed his medical at West Bromwich Albion. Finally, to tennis, and with a week to go before the start of the Australian Open in Melbourne, organisers will be hoping for no last-minute hitches after the imposed 5-day lockdown in Perth. Perth began the snap 5-day lockdown yesterday after a security guard working at a quarantine hotel tested positive for the virus. Western Australia, the state of which Perth is capital, has not had a case of locally acquired coronavirus for 10 months. Well, thankfully in Melbourne, all 370 players are now out of quarantine. They're free to practice as much as they want to and roam the streets of the city as well. Tennis Australia also confirmed over the weekend that 30,000 fans will be able to attend each day of the delayed tournament.
Thanks so much, Nick. I want to turn back to trading frenzy, as you'll see in so many of the headlines. What am I talking about? Silver prices have hit an 8-year high after calls to buy the metal on social media sparked yet again let's say a big old upset. Let me bring in the BBC's Michelle Fleury, who's in New York. Michelle, great to have you back with us, because you were explaining to us last week how amateur investors were piling shares into the games retailers called GameStop and caused them to jump 700%, and it upset a lot of people, I think. But it's a little bit complicated. So can you bring our listener through kind of what happened last week, bringing us to why silver is now what people have their eyes on?
Yeah, we had the fun of talking about GameStop shares and also cryptocurrencies and how to pronounce Dogecoin.
Dogecoin.
Dogecoin, yes, back to that again. And essentially what it is a group of Redditors, an influential chat room called Wall Street Bets, have been talking up or recommending certain shares, and they have a huge following and have been able to essentially influence the market. And you've seen a wave of individual investors buying up specific assets. So last week we were talking about GameStop, we were talking about cryptocurrencies. And the problem is that in the market, you can have something known as short sellers. These are people who are betting that the price of an asset will fall, and they do so through a whole sort of series of mechanisms. And with all of these individual investors flooding into the market, pushing the price up, obviously these other investors lost a lot of money on it. We're now seeing that starting to happen in commodities, specifically in silver. The price up currently around 7%. It is pretty unusual because the silver market operates in a somewhat different way than the stock market. But before we sort of get into more of that, what's interesting here is that this Reddit chat room over the weekend, if you look at the conversations, they seem pretty split. There was one group pushing and saying, yes, let's all rush into silver. And there was another group saying, no, that's diverting attention away from GameStop. We're having some success here. Guys, let's stick with that.
And what has happened to GameStop, do we know, since the interest, some of it anyway, went over to silver?
So let me just have a quick look at their share price and I'll get back to you on that. What was interesting on Friday or on Thursday was that you saw the share dealing platforms through which these individual investors were buying GameStop's price, there were restrictions placed. There was a huge outcry. Robinhood, one of the share dealing platforms, reversed itself. The share price skyrocketed up again. As of right now, it's down about 19%.
Okay. But, what is the word on the street? And when I say street, I mean Wall Street, Michelle, to all these fluctuations. I heard some really excited new investors on the radio over the weekend saying, like they discovered a whole new world and they weren't going to stop now. And they're going to tell their family and friends everybody can win on Wall Street. But, give us a reality check.
And it is astonishing, you talk to people, how many people are also doing this. Oh, yeah, so I bought a share on this, and because it has become so much easier now that there is this whole new flood of kind of new traders. With a click of a few buttons on an app on your phone, you can buy a share. The risks apply as they do for everyone. You can make money, but equally you can lose money. I think the real sort of bigger takeaway from all of this is not so much the rush that people are getting right now, seeing all of this playing out, but it's more that this is a group of people who weren't here before who are showing that they have real power to move the market, and that's not going to go away and change. That, I think, has been something of a wake-up call for Wall Street. The other aspect of this is the volatility. Given how much volatility we've seen and also much higher volumes, that's causing a real headache for regulators. And they are going to have to come to grips with this. What that looks like, it's too early to say. But there will be some changes and some look at, for example, how those share dealing platforms operate, how clearing houses operate, the sort of back rooms where the share deals are kind of, closed out. And so expect some changes because of this.
Well, Michelle Fleury, we are very glad we have you to talk us through it. Stay warm. I know there's a storm coming in to New York. Michelle Fleury, who brings us up to date in real time when it even comes to share prices of GameStop. Thank you so much.
This is the BBC World Service, where our new series is examining how global warming is changing life in the Arctic Circle.
As the ice melts, new opportunities are drawing the outside world further in.
They look to what they consider empty areas.
I'm Alan Little. In the first episode, I'll explore the impact climate change is having on the 4 million people who live there.
The New Arctic, Wednesday at 9:20 GMT. And in an hour, Outlook with Emily Webb.
Sash Simpson spent his childhood scavenging for food homeless on the streets of Chennai in India. He reveals how he went from there to opening up his own top restaurant in Canada. From garbage cans to gourmet food, today on Outlook.
Now we return to OS, here on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello and welcome to OS with Nuala McGovern. We're live from London and we're aiming to understand the developing story in Myanmar on this edition. There has been a military takeover with democratically elected leaders detained, including the one you may well have heard of, Aung San Suu Kyi. Now, communications are being made very difficult and it's also late at night there at the moment, but we're going to get the help of a man who used to be our correspondent there in a few minutes' time. Nick Beek is now based in Brussels, but he'll answer some of our questions about this complex story. You'll also hear from an activist who spoke to the BBC earlier from the largest city, Yangon. And we've been talking to those who left the country but are trying to understand what is happening in Myanmar. One mentions a sense of déjà vu with Ms Suu Kyi's detention, and they described their fears for their relatives who they say have locked themselves into their homes to try and stay safe as the military patrols outside. First, a bulletin of the latest world news.
BBC News, hello, I'm Gareth Barlow. The Burmese army is tightening its grip over Myanmar after seizing power in a coup, ousting Aung San Suu Kyi's democratically elected government. Our Asia-Pacific editor, Michael Bristow, reports.
Troops are on the streets of major cities and a curfew has been put in place across the country. Many in Myanmar have expressed their anger as the military once again takes over, but so far there have been no reports of violence. The army has announced a batch of new ministers to replace the civilian leaders it's forced from power and who are now in detention, including Aung San Suu Kyi. She's previously spent 15 years under house arrest for opposing military rule, so this latest situation will feel familiar. She's called for people to resist the coup.
There's been international condemnation of the Burmese military. The United Nations Security Council is reportedly planning to meet on Tuesday to discuss the coup. Here's Rory Gallimore.
Throughout the day, governments around the world have been lining up to express their dismay. Britain, the European Union, Japan and India earlier joined the United States in demanding a return to democracy in Myanmar. The most senior Republican in the US Senate, Mitch McConnell, has now called on the Biden administration to go further. He said global leaders should impose costs on those behind the takeover and described the detention of civilian leaders as horrifying. The UN Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, said she was gravely concerned and that it was a frightening time for the people of Myanmar.
The United States has said that Iran could be only weeks away from having enough material for a nuclear bomb if it keeps lifting restraints on its atomic program. The assessment was made by the new Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. Iran reined in its nuclear program under an international accord struck in 2015. A leading humanitarian aid official has criticised the Ethiopian authorities for restricting access to victims of the conflict in the northern Tigray region. Jan Egeland, head of the Norwegian Refugee Council, said aid agencies hadn't been able to reach central and western parts of the region, as well as 2 refugee camps.
We're not getting through. The roadblocks have been too many, both bureaucratic and physical. So this has to end. 2.3 million people, that's the estimate. It could be worse because we don't know. Need our assistance. The conflict has been going on for a long time. This is a very poor place with a lot of needs.
French lawmakers have begun debating a draft law to counter radicalisation, with critics imploring them not to make Islam the scapegoat. The bill to nurture respect for Republican principles is seen as one of President Emmanuel Macron's last big projects. It would discourage homeschooling and boost powers to close private schools that foster radicalism. The debate's scheduled to run for at least 2 weeks, with at least 2,600 amendments tabled. BBC News. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel has been holding a video conference with vaccine makers in an attempt to boost and accelerate supplies. European Union commissioners are also taking part in recognition of the Commission's lead role in procurement. Critics say that in using the EU's economic weight to haggle for the best terms and prices, the Commission has fallen behind countries like Britain, which got its orders in far sooner. South Africa has received its first shipment of coronavirus vaccines and is about to launch a large inoculation programme, starting with health workers. President Cyril Ramaphosa was at Johannesburg's main airport to receive 1 million doses of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which are produced by the Serum Institute of India. Africa's worst-hit country has seen 44,000 deaths from the virus. The social media platform Twitter has blocked dozens of Indian accounts in response to a legal notice filed by the Indian government, citing objections based on public order. Here's our South Asia editor, Jill McGivering.
The blocked accounts are all linked to the continuing farmers' protests against a series of agricultural reform laws. They include farmers' leaders, activists and a news magazine sympathetic to the cause. Government officials say they highlighted in their submission to Twitter about 250 accounts and tweets which they said constituted a threat to public security. The protests are now in their 3rd month, with many farmers camped on the outskirts of the capital. Last week, a tractor rally through Delhi led to clashes with police and some protesters storming the historic Red Fort.
And the British government has announced sanctions against 4 Zimbabwean security officials, accusing them of human rights abuses, including killing protesters. The State Security Minister, Owen Nube, as well as the heads of the police, the intelligence agency, and the former chief of the Presidential Guard, will have any assets in Britain frozen. They'll also be banned from visiting the United Kingdom. World News from the BBC.
Hello and welcome to OS from the BBC World Service. I'm Nuala McGovern. to their unborn baby, and another one on why it can be just so hard to get people to follow COVID-19 restrictions. There is a particular case in Israel that I am alluding to there, but we'll get into all of that a little bit later. But let's continue with what you were hearing quite a bit in the news bulletin. There about the situation in Myanmar. Its military power, just to recap, has seized power in the country after detaining Aung San Suu Kyi and other democratically elected leaders. We hear there are troops patrolling the streets in major cities. Also, communications are limited. I want to bring in the BBC's Nick Beake. You're in Brussels now, but of course you've spoken to us so many times as the BBC's Myanmar correspondent, and I imagine it must be quite shocking for you in Brussels then, seeing it as this news evolves for a place that you knew so well.
Hi Nuala, yeah, it is, I think, and just people I've spoken to today, whether on social media or whatnot, who still live in Myanmar or who are Burmese, I think everyone kind of knew that this was something that may happen. And, we look at the history books in years to come will say that 2016 to 2020, Aung San Suu Kyi was the civilian leader of Myanmar. But I've got to tell you, when I used to wake up every day in Yangon, the main commercial city, it didn't always feel like that because the military never really went away. And as we've seen today, it looks like they're back with a vengeance.
Well, why don't we play a little. There was a 1-year state of emergency announced. Our listeners may have heard, and this was on the military-owned Mayawadi television. So a little bit of the statement read out by the newsreader, who said all authority had been given to the top military commander in response to election fraud. Let's listen.
In order to perform scrutiny of the voter lists and to take action, the authority of the nation's lawmaking, governance and jurisdiction is handed over to the Commander-in-Chief in accordance with the 2008 Constitution Article 418, Sub-Article A.
So imagine watching that take place, and any thoughts, Nick, on why now?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, Nuala, because that took place, that election in Myanmar in November. It was practically the same week as the US election, and we know pretty soon after that President Trump, of course, came out and denounced the US elections. Today, the phrase that the military in Myanmar are using, they're saying it was a terrible fraud, which is almost a phrase I think Mr. Trump may well have said, or if he didn't, I think we could imagine him saying that, a terrible fraud. And so that's why they're seizing power, even though Aung San Suu Kyi's NLD party got 83% of the votes. The military-aligned party's got 6%. So, I mean, it just wasn't even close. Yet the military are claiming that they were flawed, but most people around the world, but also, crucially, the monitoring groups for elections in Myanmar, they said there may have been a few small difficulties, but nothing to change the overall course of events. Aung San Suu Kyi was the winner of that election.
We're going to hear later in the hour from a couple of people at the Burmese diaspora. One young man lives in Washington, D.C. His parents had fled Myanmar, and he was just shaking his head. He's like, I can't believe what's happening here, and now I'm watching it in his parents' home country. But let me turn, you mentioned international observers. There's David Gum-Ang, who works for an international NGO based in the capital city, Naypyidaw, and he posted a video. I want to just play a little bit of this, and let's talk out some of the issues he raises.
We are still in disbelief that this happened. And honestly, we really don't know where this coup will lead us to. For me personally, it was my worst nightmare unfolding right before my eyes. The atmosphere in Naypyidaw is eerily calm, as if we're awaiting the arrival of an imminent storm. The streets are empty as usual, and the few people you see in the street, you can obviously tell from the look on their faces that something awful just happened this morning. Army trucks can be seen here and there.
So that begins to give us a picture, Nick. Flesh it out a little bit about what you've heard, and also how can you get information from the country?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the internet blackouts come and go today in the capital, Naypyidaw, which is a weird place anyway, which is mainly made up of military and political figures. No one really lives there in any great numbers. It's Yangon, the main city, where people have said today that in the main it's been pretty normal. I mean, you've had some protests and pro-military people cheering, shouting at a place called near the Sule Pagoda, which is somewhere where I chatted to you before from, Nuala, where democracy activists have gathered. Today it was pro-military people. We have seen more people on the streets in terms of the military in Myanmar. But what happens next on the streets, I think that's really not clear. And there was this message today that Aung San Suu Kyi had apparently put out through Facebook, which people might remember we've talked about before. It's the way that everyone uses Facebook to communicate. They don't have any Instagram or Snapchat or whatever. It's all Facebook. And Aung San Suu Kyi was asking people not to take this lying down, to protest against this coup. Some people thought that the official account may have been hacked. Was this really the language that she would use? And so I think this sort of idea of suspicion and confusion about what's really happening, it's difficult to piece together. And one other sort of Facebook-specific thing, we had someone who was quite a senior member of the NLD party, Aung San Suu Kyi's party, suggesting that actually she's under house arrest in Naypyidaw. So that's to say she's not in some government or military cell somewhere. But, I mean, standing that up and sort of verifying that is really tricky at this point.
Gosh, yeah, and the other aspect, I'm just wondering, Nick, if it's possible to piece it together, hearing there from the NGO representative saying, you know, the streets are empty, and you say it can be kind of strange as a city anyway. If Aung San Suu Kyi is calling for people to not take it lying down, from the young people I was speaking to, they said their relatives had locked themselves into their houses and were trying to lie low. So it doesn't sound, for example, that people are pushing back, or is it possible to know?
I think that's fair to say that people aren't pushing back for now, and there's a couple of reasons for that. If we talk about sort of people going onto the streets of Paris or London or Washington, young people energised, you know, of any age, energised, and they really feel strongly, they can do that. And we see around the world, you know, security forces, for example, thinking Russia at the moment and the protests there, they often meet the protesters with varying degree of violence, to put it quite frankly. Mm-hmm. In Myanmar, it's so different. There are 2 years which are etched in history with blood, sadly. 1988, when there was a massacre, when students tried to protest for a democratic transition, they were mown down by government guns, the military's snipers. It was a bloodbath. And in 2007, we saw monks trying to protest, the so-called Saffron Revolution. Again, that was brutally crushed. You know, that lives in people's minds. You know, uncles and aunties, mums and dads, if they weren't killed or beaten up during that, they're the sort of stories they pass on. And I think that's why you've got this sort of collective nervousness. And it goes back even further, Nuala, because this Myanmar military, ruled with an iron rod for more than 50 years. People were scared. They weren't able to express themselves. There were whispers in the tea shops all around the countries. No one could really come out and say what they really felt. And that sort of oppressive regime, that lives long. You know, I suggest it goes through generations. So there are very, very brave people. I know you've been speaking to a few, and I certainly met them when I was there, but they need to have strength in numbers. And it's a really difficult situation, I think, for a lot of people.
Thank you so much for your analysis, Nick. Really good to have you on. That is my colleague, Nick Beek. Of course, we often speak to him these days in Brussels, but he is our former correspondent in Myanmar and helping us understand exactly what it is that is happening today. Let me turn to another witness account. Our colleagues at Newsday, they managed to establish a line with an activist in Yangon, one of the cities, a grassroots activist, and for her own safety, we're not using her real name. Let's listen.
Myanmar people, we are being traumatized with the coup thing because since 1962, after that, our life are all ruined, our education system, our generations, everything we were militarized since that time. So after 2010, the election is there and the democratic, kind of space opening up, and we were hopeful. But after the coup news coming back again, we all feel like we have that fear inside, deeply inside, generation to generation. We're all deeply traumatized. So I'm sure that people are already fearful with a lot of things. Right now, what happened here is the reality, is the real political reality of Myanmar. Because 2008 constitution that we are being working with was not for democratic nation. It was especially a constitution trying to legitimize the military participation and systematize their corruption. So that's what happened. Now the mask is off, the military show its true color. So I think it's a high time for all of us to reconsider what is the real solution, for Myanmar.
Thanks so much to her for speaking with the BBC. As I mentioned, I'm going to bring you a conversation a little bit later with two young men whose families fled Myanmar, and they'll give us their take as well on what they're hearing from their relatives. OS on the BBC with Nuala McGovern. We are live from London. I want to take a look at some of the other stories being worked on in the BBC newsrooms right now. Nigeria has offered to support Mozambique in its fight against Islamist insurgents in the gas-rich northern province of Cabo Delgado. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, more than 2,000 people have been killed and more than 500,000 others have been displaced in the violence. Alan Burns, the co-creator of The Munsters and The Mary Tyler Moore Show, which is credited with changing TV depictions of women, has died aged 85. The Emmy-winning and Oscar-nominated producer and screenwriter died on Saturday. His son Matt confirmed to Variety. And an Anglo-Saxon graveyard described as having huge potential has been unearthed beneath former university student housing in England. King's College Cambridge discovered the extensive cemetery containing more than 60 graves after demolishing a group of 1930s buildings. Evidence of Iron Age structures and Roman earthworks were also identified. Okay, let us turn back to coronavirus and COVID-19. I want to welcome back Professor Manfred Green, a medical doctor and Professor of Epidemiology in the School of Public Health at the University of Haifa in Israel. He is on the National Committee for Immunisation and the National Committee for the Control of Epidemics. Good to have you back with us, Professor. I want to start... Hi, how are you? I want to start with some stories from your part of the world. We saw a headline that Israel says it's transferring 5,000 doses of vaccine to frontline Palestinian health workers in the occupied territories. We have been hearing, of course, that Israel is one of the most advanced vaccination programs, but Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza have had no vaccinations so far. This is something really contentious, I have to say. Whenever we speak about it, Professor, I often hear from listeners afterwards with dispute or debate about exactly who's responsible for vaccinating people in those territories. Do you worry about politics getting in the way of public health? And also I'd be curious how you feel about those 5,000 doses.
Yeah, certainly. First of all, I think it's very good news that there's a start, that some doses have been transferred. There's no doubt in my mind that we have to find a way of making sure that the Palestinians are vaccinated. And I think that we need to work very closely with the World Health Organization to do that. We certainly have a responsibility, just not only because they're neighbors, but because we have very close administrative relationships, whichever way you look at it. And regardless of the politics, we're part of the same group. So I really think that we should be very active in making sure that they are vaccinated.
And what about 5,000 doses? That seems small to me, but what would you say?
Well, it's. I guess in a way it's symbolic, although it's good to know that this is going to healthcare workers and it's a start. I know that the Palestinian Authority have in fact ordered other vaccines. I think maybe it's the Russian or Chinese one, or maybe AstraZeneca, I'm not sure. But we need to do everything possible to work together. There's no doubt that we need to do that. Not just, it's regardless of politics. We're not going to overcome this pandemic if we have these political divisions. The virus doesn't know about these political divisions.
Indeed, and if people are side by side, it is, I have to say, an issue, as I mentioned, that gets people very upset, I suppose, and trying to figure out exactly where the responsibility lies. There is the Oslo Accords, but then it depends how people interpret them as well. I know the UN is pushing for Israel to help as much as possible. Let me stay in the area, however. Let me go to Jerusalem in particular. Thousands of ultra-Orthodox men attended the funeral of a rabbi over the weekend, as I understand it, in Jerusalem. So a mass funeral in contravention of COVID rules. Now, I think this is interesting as I read this, Professor, because this was something you were concerned about, even as the vaccinations were going at great speed, that there may be certain groups of people that would not follow the COVID-19 restrictions. How do you see this story?
You know, it's complex, and certainly there are subgroups such as the ultra-Orthodox who have a higher rate of morbidity. In other words, a lot of illness and a lot of deaths. A lot of the deaths are from that community. So there's a lot of spread, and they are not necessarily following the regulations that they should, as you saw. I think that we have to look for ways to make to communicate to them and to work together. I don't think there's much point in attacking one another verbally and criticizing. I think we have to try and find ways to actually understand what the different minority groups are thinking and how they're behaving, and to try and work together with them. And I think that this is such an important thing. There is an element sometimes that there is more reliance on religious leaders than on medical leaders and so on. These, I think, can be overcome. There are many people in the ultra-Orthodox community who recognize that this is a major problem. If you'll allow me just one mention, one of the well-known people is Yehuda Meshi Zahav, who is head of the Zaka movement, which actually helps to in relief organizations and helps in disasters. And he's ultra-Orthodox, and he's put out a call to the ultra-Orthodox community to try and work together to prevent this kind of action, which is just spreading the disease.
I think it is reminiscent in some ways, I feel, about vaccine take-up that we've talked about within certain communities of you need to have trusted leaders really to push that message, I think is what I'm hearing. But what about with the vaccine uptake? Because you also voiced concerns about potentially certain groups not going ahead with it. How does it look this week?
Well, my feeling, and I don't have hard data at the moment, but it looks like we are now starting to encounter those that are less willing to be vaccinated. It went very well in the beginning, and we've, I think in the over 60s, we've reached maybe over 80%, but it's that last 15, 20% where you find people who, for whatever reason, are resisting. And I think in the younger people, it's going to be much more. And again, sometimes in the minorities. We've done some studies that in the Arab community in Israel, there's more resistance. Why? The reasons are varied, but there's a lot of misinformation. And that's one of the issues that we have to deal with. The social media, I'll just give you one example. I don't even like to say it, but I'll say it because it's coming up so often. There's this myth and misinformation that somehow the vaccine may impact on fertility. And that's an old thing, I think I might have mentioned it before, that has been in Africa and in Asia, where the concept is that maybe other governments or other powers are using vaccines to impact on the fertility of people in other countries. And that's completely untrue. There's no biological basis. But unfortunately, this is what's going around in the social media.
I understand. I have heard that. There was a conversation taking place in the UK about that. I've heard one in the United States as well. So It is very funny, the ones that actually get traction. And I understand you not wanting to repeat it, but we will underline again that it is not true, totally unsubstantiated.
Nothing. Yeah, completely.
Let us talk about something great with pregnancy and COVID instead. A report over the past couple of days that pregnant women transfer COVID antibodies to their unborn baby, apparently. Tell us what you know about this. Does it happen with all diseases?
Yeah, it happens with many diseases. There's one particularly, we vaccinate women. We recommend vaccinating pregnant women with diphtheria, particularly the pertussis component, the whooping cough. And that transfers antibodies to the baby and protects the baby for the first couple of months until they develop antibodies and they get back through vaccination. So it's certainly well known. And of course, it happens with many diseases, measles, most diseases. The fact that it's transferring is good news. I mean, this is good for the baby, and I think it's going to be. The reports that I've read are actually for naturally acquired. In other words, women who've had the COVID-19 and then they've transferred antibodies. But I think it'll be very good for vaccination. So I know there's been a debate about vaccinating pregnant women, but I think there's pretty much consensus that women should be given the opportunity to be vaccinated at least in the second and third trimesters, although it's not impossible to do it in the first, but some more cautious may say do it in the second and third, and that will do two things. It'll protect the mother, pregnant women are at a higher risk of severe disease, and now we believe it'll protect the infant for the first few months. So I think that would be really nice. I mean, that's a very good thing to do.
Let me go just very briefly in our last minute. In Israel, there's been this spat between the EU and AstraZeneca about the vaccine, about the number that they were getting. However, Germany, they have a medical authority that was recommending that over 65s not get it, that it wasn't tested broadly enough, they thought. Other countries are going ahead with it. Did Israel vaccinate with AstraZeneca for over 65s?
We haven't used the AstraZeneca vaccine. But I don't know if it's related directly, but I just quickly give a quick advertisement mention. But there's a blog or an opinion piece in the BMJ that I'm an author on as well, which was in the last couple of days, where we talk about vaccine nationalism. And it's part of a whole process now of this kind of, struggle for vaccines. And it's showing up some of the, say the less pretty side of governments and of ourselves. There's sort of a little bit of selfishness, which is hard to overcome, but I think that we really have to try and find ways. And I know in the European Union, or generally in Europe, it's complicated because there was this sharing agreements, and now AstraZeneca is having to choose where to supply the vaccine.
Let me give your name again, Professor Manfred Green. He's a medical doctor, professor of epidemiology in the School of Public Health at the University of Haifa in Israel, and the BMJ is the British Medical Journal. I think people might want to read about that on vaccine nationalism. Thanks so much for joining us, Professor.
This is the BBC World Service, where Priscilla Nyepe will be bringing us stories on health.
Africa, like the rest of the world, is focused on dealing with COVID-19. But that's not the whole picture.
There has been a lot of talk recently about coconut oil.
It helps to detox the body.
However, it has not been scientifically proven.
When you take coconut oil, both your good cholesterol will go up and also your bad cholesterol will go up.
Africa Life Clinic will be finding out what's affecting the continent's health, good and bad, now and in the future.
Regular swimming, even just half an hour at a time, is effective for reducing anxiety.
I would recommend it to anyone. Come into the water, have fun, feel calm.
Africa Life Clinic on the BBC World Service. Sunday at 9:30 GMT.
Welcome to OS from the BBC World Service. I'm Nuala McGovern. Thousands of Russians came out in the freezing cold over the past 2 weekends to join demonstrations over the jailing of opposition leader Alexei Navalny. For many, their bigger call, it's about change. They're tired of President Putin. And I've been speaking to two of the people who went out to protest this weekend. They'll explain to you why they risked confrontation with the Russian security forces. That conversation coming up in a couple of minutes' time.
BBC News with Gareth Barlow. The Burmese army is tightening its grip over Myanmar after seizing power in a coup. Troops are on the streets of the capital and Myanmar's biggest city, Yangon. A curfew is in place. The army has announced the appointment of new ministers to replace those ousted from power. Myanmar's civilian leaders, including Aung San Suu Kyi, have been detained. There's been wide-scale international condemnation of the Burmese military. The United Nations Security Council is reportedly planning to hold an emergency meeting on Tuesday to discuss the coup. The head of the UN Refugee Agency has described the situation in Ethiopia's Tigray region as extremely grave and has urged the government to stop restricting access for humanitarian agencies. Filippo Grandi was speaking after visiting a camp where he said Eritrean refugees had complained about incidents of rape. The United States has warned that Iran could be only weeks away from having enough material to make a nuclear bomb. Iran lifted restraints on its atomic program after Donald Trump pulled out of an international nuclear agreement with Iran. The Biden administration has indicated that it's ready to negotiate a return to the accord. Kosovo has become the latest Muslim country to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. It's also recognised Jerusalem as Israel's capital, putting it at odds with the rest of the Islamic world. French legislators have begun debating a draft law to counter radicalism, with critics imploring them not to make Islam the scapegoat. The bill to nurture respect for Republican principles is seen as one of President Emmanuel Macron's last big projects. And Twitter has blocked dozens of accounts in India in response to a legal notice filed by the Indian government. The blocked accounts are linked to farmers' leaders and supporters of the continuing farmers' protests against agricultural reform laws. From the BBC in London, that's the latest world news.
Welcome to OS from the BBC World Service. I'm Nuala McGovern. Good to have you with us. We are following events in Myanmar after a military coup. We want to, this half hour, explain the recent history in that country and also bring you a conversation with two young men whose parents fled Myanmar. Both of them are now looking uneasily, one from the States, the other from India, at what is evolving in Myanmar. One said it feels like it's deja vu with Miss Suu Kyi detained yet again. But before that, I want to turn to Russia. You might have seen over the weekend there were thousands of Russians that took part in unauthorized protests to demand the release of the jailed opposition leader Alexei Navalny. He was jailed on his return to Russia after recovering from an attempt to kill him with a nerve agent. He blames security services for the attack. The Kremlin denies that. There were more than 5,000 people detained after these latest protests, according to one monitoring group. In Moscow, police closed metro stations and actually blocked off the city centre as well. Maria Kiselyova from BBC Russian was on the streets of St. Petersburg during the protests.
Sunday morning for us just started with a change of plans because we had planned to start our reporting on the Nevsky Prospect, which is in the very center of St. Petersburg. And this is where the so-called unauthorized meeting was supposed to start. But when we went out of the metro 2 hours before the rally, the whole Nevsky, which is practically the main street of the city, was blocked. The road was blocked from the pavement with metal fences, and more than that, the streets that lead to Nevsky were blocked completely with the trucks and buses standing across the roads. So half an hour before the meeting, the protesters' Telegram channel said that there is a new meeting point. We rushed there. It's a square in front of the youth theater, and there was a big crowd already. I think several hundred people. It was growing, and there was a lot of police and National Guard officers and special ammunition. Arrests started almost right away. Some of them looked quite harsh, and the crowd fled to a small garden nearby. Police kept arresting people, and in some cases, I saw that the protesters were trying to fight for those who were detained to help them escape. Some of them were successful, but mostly just provoked more violence.
I understand. So you bring us kind of the tension that was there. But you mentioned Mr. Navalny. I mentioned a little bit about him as I introduced. But how significant is he as a figure, do you think, for those people that were out protesting?
To me, actually, it seemed that the motives of the protesters were not purely political. It would not be right to say that they are all just supporters of Alexei Navalny. First of all, many people are afraid of being charged with extremism, And when you ask them, they just say, well, I was curious, or I just came for a walk here. But those who do speak about their motives say that they're tired of lies, for example, or they had come to the rally a week before and now came to protest the police violence or to show that they are not afraid. So it's, again, kind of a backlash. Of course, many people mention the film that Alexei Navalny's team issued about the palace, but it's not the main thing that people mention.
Maria Kisilyova from BBC Russian, thanks so much to her monitoring the protests for us in St. Petersburg. But let's find out a little bit more about what has been driving some people onto the streets. I got to speak to two more people in Moscow before I came on air. We're not using their real names for their own safety. We're calling them Anna and Alexei. Both took part in the protests. Alexei answers first.
Now I'm going because of the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, because the case that they opened to jail him, and because they made such strong, violent moves against the protesters.
And let me bring Anna in. Tell me a little bit about your reason for going to the streets.
I got reasons to go on the protests. Most of them are because I'm against political persecution, and I agree with Alexei. All this violent stuff they do with common people as we are. We don't do anything violent for them, but they do this for us, and it's inappropriate.
Would you have called yourself a supporter of Alexei Navalny before this?
Yeah, I think I'm a long-time supporter. I helped him when he made his first move with trying to go for be a mayor of Moscow in 2012. So yeah, I will say I'm a long-time supporter.
And what about you, Anna?
I like him as a person, as a TikToker, as a YouTuber, and also I like his political program. He made trying to become a president of Russia in 2018. But I like him as the hope Russian young people and even just all Russian people have, because we are so much tired of this government.
But do you think that with these protests that there could even be a real difference in the country, Alexei?
I believe that the peaceful protest is a very difficult and very timely process. So I think that it's not about this year or next year maybe, but I believe that every mistake that our government makes and every big event that opposition organizing is moving us tighter to the goal.
Anna, what would you think about that?
Yeah, I think that peaceful protests, they make sense, yes.
What about the protests yesterday? How would you describe what it was like to be there? Anna?
It was like I felt myself in the middle of some revolution. I made a video message to my friends like, guys, I'm in the middle of this. But it was a really emotional moment. Honestly, it was really a lot of violence and cruelty around me. All the young guys were packed to Avtozaks, and I was like standing in the middle of cross streets, and it was all the house happening, and I was like standing, and okay, the main thing I can do is not to feel fear, and so it's my aim for today.
But was that difficult to not be afraid?
It's the thing that you change inside yourself, and it's my belief that it changes everything the rest.
What do you think, Alexei? Are you ever afraid when you're out there? Because, you know, they talked about unprecedented security measures. You know, we've all seen the videos of people being detained and taken away. And, oh my goodness, it looked so cold. I mean, quite difficult to stand your ground, I would imagine.
I would say I was surprised that people weren't frightened. Like, people knew that they will go and the police will try to stop them, that they would try to beat them and tease them. But I thought that the crowd overall was relentless, and I felt decisiveness in people. Like, they knew why they going out to the street. They knew that this is the real reason. It's not like the prices are high or, I don't know, the taxes are high. But that was the real reason, because just the things that came to Russia, the unprecedented measure of pressure with Alexei Navalny, with his poisoning, with the jail, the world colored in black and white. Like, this is the right ones, and this is the wrong ones. And so when people saw a lot of photos of police brutality, they just know who's right and who's wrong. And that's the point that made the decision for all of us.
Gosh, that's very interesting because, yes, we do cover protests so much, and a lot of the times when people go out on the street, it is something within their day-to-day life which is at breaking point. I don't know, that they cannot get a job, for example. We were hearing that in Tunisia, or maybe it starts with the price of bread in other protests that we start with. But with this, you're talking about the actual political structure within the country?
Yeah, I believe that Alexei Navalny did a very strong political and moral deed. Like, I don't know any other examples in modern history. One person was in another country. He knew that when he will go to his own country, he will be jailed, or maybe he will be killed. Possibly he will be killed. Mm-hmm. And then he made it anyway. Like, that's the thing that people can't ignore.
He seemed so brave, and this braveness inspired people. People are so hopeful. I think that people I saw yesterday and the week before, they are so hopeful.
You know, a Kremlin spokesperson has denounced the protests as illegal and says there were hooligans among the crowd. Tomorrow is a big day. A court in Moscow will decide whether Mr. Navalny will be imprisoned for breaking the terms of a previous suspended sentence, as they say, the Russian authorities he was serving for fraud. What do you think happens?
I wish he will be freed, and so our first goal will be achieved.
And what is it you want ultimately?
To break the regime, I believe, to change it, to make Putin's go away, to make independent judges, to be normal, not authoritarian country.
In this question, I'm really depressive. My point of view is like I'm not really hopeful about happy ending, but at the same time, I think that peaceful protests, they make sense because it's the only way for us, or just people, to show that we are not agree, to show that we need changes, to say it, and like we shouldn't stop with this. We shouldn't sit home and feel fear and all of this. We should go, we should say, we should go with huge crowds as it was yesterday, and to say we are not agree with that.
Are you looking for the same outcome as Alexei outlines? The removal of President Putin, for example, and a change in government?
Yeah, I want changes, yeah. I really agree with Alexei. I want normal judges, the reduction of political persecution and like all this. Sorry if I can't find words because I feel really emotional about all this topic.
Thanks so much to Anna and Alexei. Not their real names, I should say. They wanted to remain anonymous for their safety, but they were explaining their experiences of protesting over the past weekend. So I want to bring in my colleague Olga Ivshina from BBC Russian to try and get a broader understanding of some of what we've been hearing with these protests, as also the grievances perhaps that were laid out. Good to have you back with us, Olga. I mean, Anna and Alexei, they are looking for change in government, but what do you think it is that is motivating that for a young person in Moscow or St. Petersburg or wherever it may be in Russia at this moment that is galvanizing them?
Well, I think it's very different. You know, what is unique about these protests is that polls show that 25% of protesters, of people who are protested this Sunday or a week ago, the people who have just joined the movement, so they're newcomers, and their ideas very much depend on their age, I would say. You know, so youngsters, people, I don't know, under 25, yes, they mostly want significant political change. You know, they have been born with Putin, and the only thing they have seen in their life is is Putin's rule, and they're not satisfied with the opportunities they have under such a leader. But the core of protesters are people who are older, something like polls tell that it's something from 28 to 40, from 30 to 40 roughly, and they just want more justice because they face corruption very often, and it's not something very high up as people in the West think. It's on the ground corruption. So to get into good school, or to get surgery in the hospital properly done, or to get a proper care in hospital, they need to give bribes and so-called gifts. They want a more fair society. They want a society where you can go to court and it's not the prosecutor or someone calling the judge who decides what the ruling will be, but the independent judge. That's the things they face in their everyday life, and that's things they want to get changed. And to prove that, I'll tell you that the majority of opposition leaders, the majority of Alexei Navalny's team is behind the bars at the moment. They have been detained, arrested, etc. So they are not coordinating the protest, but people keep coming because they're coming not for Navalny as a political leader mostly. They are mostly coming not for something, but against things they see and face.
So this sounds like what people might express as like death by 1,000 cuts, in the sense of all these small aggressions when it comes to corruption or trying to live your life or have a good life. What would the Kremlin say in response if somebody said, Russian society is very difficult to live a free and just life?
Well, they keep saying that it's all bollocks, and they will flood you with examples that they spent, money here on some national projects that, for example, medics working with COVID are getting extra pay. But when you actually speak to those medics, they will say, we got a few times this bonus payment for working in the dangerous circumstances, but then it all stopped, or it goes to the head of the hospital. We're actually not seeing it. You speak to firemen, firefighters, and they would say, we have to buy significant amounts of our equipment ourselves, or we have to work extra shifts for no money. So there is this very positive rhetoric on state TV and from state officials, but when you go to the ground, so to say, when you meet actual people, they don't see that. I mean, even officially, every seventh Russian person in Russia is living beyond the poverty line, so they're extremely poor. And this is only official statistics. And analysts say that actually this figure is 2 or 3 times higher. So people are living in extreme poverty all over Russia. And it's not, Western Europe. In Russia, you have winters with minus 40 degrees. So you need a lot of warm clothes to fight that, simply. For example, you can't live the whole year round with just one pair of sneakers. You need a bunch of different shoes just to make it through the year, or to send someone, your kids to school. I know families where kids, one kid comes from school and gives his pair of boots to the other kid so that he can go to school, and sometimes they're late to lessons. That's the level of troubles some Russians are dealing with. And of course, they don't buy these sunny rhetorics from the state TV.
I understand. Olga Ivshina, thank you. And I do apologise just for one of the words that was used there, language-wise. But Olga Ivshina from BBC Russian, putting into context for us the protests taking place in Russia. Listening to OS from the BBC World Service. Let me bring you some of the stories my colleagues are working on right now in our newsroom. Serena Williams, she says she may not have been able to play in the Australian Open had it not been pushed back by 3 weeks to allow players to quarantine. Serena is chasing a record equaling 24th major singles title next week. She said she needed the extra time to fully recover from an Achilles injury sustained at the US Open in September. We were talking about this earlier on the programme. The price of silver has hit an 8-year high on Monday amid social media calls to buy the metal and emulate the trading frenzy that surrounded US games retailer GameStop last week. I laugh because trading frenzy, I've seen it in so many headlines. Let me turn to Tony Bennett. The jazz music legend is trending on Twitter after he revealed that he's been living with Alzheimer's disease for the past 4 years. The singer, who's 94, is not always sure where he is or what is happening around him. His wife Susan was also speaking to the media. However, Mr. Bennett has so far been spared many of the worst characteristics of the disease. 50 minutes past the hour, you're with OS. Let us turn back to our main story today, the military takeover in Myanmar. If you missed it, the army has arrested democratically elected leaders and taken control. They say recent elections were fraudulent. They've declared a state of emergency for a year. We've just seen a response coming in from US President Biden. He's calling on the military to immediately relinquish the power they have taken. We're also seeing the UN Security Council is going to hold an emergency meeting about the situation on Tuesday. So perhaps we will be talking about that this time tomorrow. In a moment, we're going to hear from some people who are closely following the story because they have family connections to Myanmar. But first, here's a few things you might want to know about the country to help you better understand what's taking place.
Myanmar is in Southeast Asia between Bangladesh, India, China, Laos and Thailand. It was under British rule for 6 decades, regaining independence in 1948. It's also known as Burma. Military rulers changed its official name to Myanmar in the 1980s, partly to break with that colonial past. Since independence, the military has mostly been in charge. And that's where Aung San Suu Kyi comes in. She's the political leader who led the campaign to change things. Her dad was a hero of the independence movement, assassinated when she was a child. And as she argued for democracy, she was put under house arrest for many years. She got the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts. Gradually, the military gave in to change. Aung San Suu Kyi's party won a huge victory in an election in 2015. She wasn't allowed to officially become president, though. She was blocked by a technicality in the constitution because her children, with her British husband, hold foreign passports. That's why she's often described in the news as
the de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi.
The country's de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi.
In other words, although she didn't have the job title of president, she was really the one in charge. Aung San Suu Kyi's international reputation was damaged by the treatment of a Muslim minority group in Myanmar, the Rohingyas. After militant attacks on police stations in 2017, the army responded by attacking Rohingya villages. Hundreds of thousands fled to Bangladesh. Myanmar's government rejected accusations from UN investigators of indiscriminate killings, gang rapes and the burning of villages, which could be considered genocide. Aung San Suu Kyi was accused of doing nothing to stop atrocities. She personally defended the army's actions at a court hearing in The Hague.
Thanks very much to Ben James for that explainer. Well, let me bring you a couple of people that are part of the Burmese diaspora. So their families left Myanmar and they're watching, as you can imagine, the developments very closely. Adnan is 20. He lives in India. His parents fled Myanmar in the 80s. Min is 24, lives near Washington, D.C. in the States, and his family moved there in 1994 from Myanmar.
These past 24 hours for me have been kind of just on the edge. Last night when I got the news of the coup, I was just panicking. I was, telling my mom, it's like, hey, can we call them? Can we talk to them? Can we contact them? Like, what's happening? What's happening? I've just been afraid for my family for a bit now.
Is any information coming through, Min? Are you able to get in touch with anyone?
Well, actually, beforehand, not too long ago, I would say like an hour or so, my aunt did call my mom via phone. I believe, I'm not sure what app they used, but apparently they do have phone lines up for now. Internet usage is still down over there, but I think for now phones are okay. I haven't been able to contact them. As far as I know, and this is from even a few days ago, they've been hiding in their homes, just kind of afraid of, stepping outside with the military kind of running amok. I wanted to talk to my mom. She showed me this Facebook. It was a Facebook Live video of someone kind of driving around the streets of Rangoon, sort of commentating that there was just basically, it's barren.
Did they have any inclination that something like this might happen?
Yeah, that's my guess, is that possibly this was something that people in the country knew about, and now that the ball's rolling, we're like how long has this been going on? Like that again, I'm not sure. But considering that I got the news last night, and then my mother telling me that just a couple days prior that they were hiding from the military, I don't know what happened between then and now that we're just getting the news now that all this is happening.
Let's hear what we can from Adnan Min as well, and let's hear what he is hearing, if anything, from relatives. Hey, Adnan.
Yeah, hello. And to go back to Min's point, I think the people in Myanmar did have an idea of what was going to happen, because like a week earlier, everyone was panicking. That there were rumors of a coup going, but nobody took it seriously, like as in nobody thought this was going to happen, but now it did.
Huh. So can you elaborate on what you saw or heard or what people have told you? And I will, of course, underline that we can't verify this right now.
There have been news circulating around Myanmar that among the supporters of the military that the voting system is fraudulent and all that, and that the military was going to take action and all that.
Adnan and Min, you have quite a bit in common, really. Would you like to ask each other any questions? Min, would you like to ask Adnan anything?
This feels like a strange question, but like, do you feel that this is some sort of strange deja vu where Aung San Suu Kyi is detained, as she, famously was, in the house arrest for years, and now that the military is taking over again? Because this feels like, when I visited my family there was still even like rumblings years ago of people saying that the civilian government may fall to the military. And now we're seeing it again.
I am a bit paranoid about the situation, but my heart says that we can overcome this, because I feel like our generation will not allow what happened in the past to happen again.
Yeah, I agree with that. And my hope is that for our generation, because of the advent of social media, I hope this spreads out more. But
yeah.
I don't know. Like I said, there's definitely this instilled fear that I feel that's going on with my family, with your family, Adnan. There's a part of me that I hope we can somehow get through this, and we can help them and revolt with them. But the extent of Myanmar's military, I don't know, man. It's frightening.
Yeah, of course. I don't hate the military. I hate those in power.
Would you like to ask Min a question?
Would you come back to Myanmar if you had the chance?
You see, even before this, I was not a fan of how Myanmar, was just in general homophobic. I've never really agreed with that. Would I come back regardless to visit family after this? In a better day, in a better lifetime, I hope so. A better timeline, really, and I hope so.
Thanks so much to Adnan and Min for speaking to us. Really interesting to hear their thoughts, and also that they were in touch with family members just before I got to speak to them, before we came on air. No doubt we'll continue following this story today on the BBC World Service, and again tomorrow as we try to understand exactly what it is that's happening in Myanmar. Thanks for spending part of your day with us here on OS from the BBC World Service.
This is the BBC World Service. Harriet Gilbert brings us February's World Book Club.
I'm joined by American author Bill Bryson to discuss his #1 bestseller, Notes from a Small Island. An affectionate portrait of a country he'd lived in for 20 years, Bryson's book has become one of the most loved explorations of Britain and its eccentricities.
World Book Club with Bill Bryson. Sunday at 14 GMT. And at 1850 GMT, it's Witness History.
In 1994, the first scheduled rail services from London under the English Channel to France were launched. The cheapest ticket cost £95, around $152, and many passengers had booked their tickets years in advance.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Food has always been crucial in Sash Simpson's life. As a child living on the streets of India and struggling to survive, it was the lack of it.
I didn't know where my next meal was coming. I took the money that I begged for. It went for food.
But after a chance encounter at a bus station, he ended up in Canada cooking for a huge family of over 30 adopted siblings.
I did spaghetti on Wednesday nights. I'd cook this 2 massive pots, a couple of pots of spaghetti sauce. I'm such a big fan of spaghetti, I'd like to have seconds.
And from there, he moved on to serving up food in Toronto's fanciest restaurants.
From Cornish hens to foie gras to gnocchi, making these elaborate salads. It's like, to me, a salad was leaves on a plate. We're making elevated salad that looks so beautiful.
Today on Outlook, how Sash went from garbage cans to gourmet food. His story after the news.
BBC News, hello, I'm Gareth Barlow. The US President Joe Biden has threatened to take action against the Burmese military after it seized power in a coup that's seen the detention of civilian leaders, including Aung San Suu Kyi. Mr. Biden called on Myanmar's military to relinquish power immediately, or the US would take what he called appropriate action. The UN Security Council is planning to hold an emergency meeting on Tuesday to discuss the coup. In Myanmar itself, troops are on the streets of the capital Naypyidaw and the biggest city Yangon. A curfew has been put in place and a military-run TV station has announced the appointment of new ministers. In a statement that appears to have been written before her arrest, Aung San Suu Kyi urged people to resist the coup. Jonathan Head has this report.
Few had believed the military would go so far as deposing a popularly elected government. It still retains significant guaranteed power under the Constitution, despite seeing its own party perform disastrously in the general election last November. The generals had complained about electoral fraud, but provided little evidence to justify challenging the overwhelming victory of Aung San Suu Kyi's party. Yet they're now using those complaints to explain their power grab, carried out just hours before the newly elected parliament was due to start forming the next government.
The United States has said that Iran could be only weeks away from having enough material for a nuclear bomb if it keeps lifting restraints on its atomic program. The assessment was made by the new Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. Alan Johnston reports.
He said that if Iran pressed ahead, it might be just a matter of weeks before it had enough of the material needed to sustain a nuclear chain reaction in an atomic bomb. Iran agreed to rein in its nuclear program under an international accord struck in 2015, but President Trump tore up that deal. In retaliation, the Iranians have been breaching commitments they made in the agreement and reinvigorating their nuclear program. The Biden administration wants both sides to return to the 2015 accord.
Alan Johnston reporting. The head of the United Nations Refugee Agency has described the situation in Ethiopia's Tigray region as extremely grave. Filippo Grandi was speaking after visiting a camp where he said Eritrean refugees were complaining about incidents of rape. He urged the government to stop restricting access for humanitarian agencies.
The UN works in Yemen. The UN works in northern Syria. There are well-established protocols and systems that we are ready to discuss with the government, and we have already started discussing with the government so that we are able to work even in a volatile situation.
World News from the BBC. Kosovo has become the latest Muslim country to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. It has also recognised Jerusalem as Israel's capital, putting it at odds with the rest of the Islamic world. In recent months, a series of Arab states, including the UAE and Bahrain, have moved to normalise their ties with the Israelis. But unlike Kosovo, they won't be establishing their embassies in Jerusalem. French lawmakers have begun debating a draft law to counter radicalisation, with critics imploring them not to make Islam the scapegoat. The bill to nurture respect for Republican principles is seen as one of President Emmanuel Macron's last big projects. It would discourage homeschooling and boost powers to close private schools that foster radicalism. The kind of social media campaign that inspired an Islamist to behead a teacher would become a criminal offence. A Russian court has fined Alexei Navalny's wife, Yulia, $260 for taking part in nationwide protests on Sunday. She was among those detained near the Moscow prison where her husband is being held. Her lawyer, Svetlana Davidova, said they wouldn't accept the ruling.
We don't agree with the decision and will appeal it after we receive the full text. Only the title of the judgment was delivered. We don't know the reason for the decision. We'll get it in 3 days, prepare an appeal and file it.
Alexei Navalny himself is due in court on Tuesday when prosecutors will ask the judge to activate a 3.5-year suspended sentence he was given in 2014. The social media platform Twitter has blocked dozens of Indian accounts in response to a legal notice filed by the Indian government. The blocked accounts are linked to farmers' leaders and supporters of the continuing farmers' protests against agricultural reform laws. The accounts of a news magazine, which is critical of the government, was also targeted. Government officials said the action was necessary to prevent threats to public order. BBC News.
Hello, you're tuned to Outlook, globetrotting through extraordinary personal stories with me, Emily Webb. Later, we're revisiting an astonishing story about the Italian astronaut who nearly drowned in space.
The water covered my eyes and then traveled down. As soon as the water found my nostrils, it just went up and completely covered my nose. So it was a pretty uncomfortable situation because all at once I couldn't see anything because not only was dark outside, but I had water covering my eyes. I couldn't breathe through my nose, and I felt isolated. And when I tried to tell ground that I was having trouble finding my way, they couldn't hear me, and I could not hear them either. I think maybe I could hear them very faintly, but they could not hear me.
It is a nail-biter, so do stay with us for that. Our first stop is the Canadian city of Toronto. The doors are shut at the moment because of the pandemic, but this is where the chef Sash Simpson runs his restaurant. It's high-end. On the menu you'd find shaved heirloom carrots, an Asian pear, or frite with black truffle and parmesan. But it's also a world away from where Sash started out. That was on the streets of the Indian city of Chennai. Sash doesn't really have any memories of life before he was homeless. He's never located his birth family. What he does remember is struggling to survive as a little boy on his own in a hostile environment.
It was a bad place. When I think about it and pictures do come about, sometimes it's blurry, right? It's like watching TV and you can see the clear picture and all of a sudden it goes away. And then you have to wait to come back, then all of a sudden it's lost.
When you talk about those pictures and it being like an old television, is there one image you can think of?
I remember standing, putting my hand out, begging for money, living on the streets and begging and stealing and whatever you can do to survive, and jumping on trains. I just wish when I jumped on trains, I knew the spots, that I could reroute where I was from.
How old do you think you were when all of that was happening?
I was about 4, maybe 5.
And did you have any idea how it was you started living on the streets?
No. Me living on the street, it was just, I would never want to go back to that. Just bad memories.
Tell me about the day that changed. Where were you and what were you doing when your life did change?
I remember being in the movie theater. I used to sleep in there. Having a roof over my head in India was amazing. But I had to clean the place up with other kids. And I remember one morning, I just wanted to go outside. I got out of the movie theater. Across the street was the bus terminal. And I walked towards the bus terminal and I sat at the first empty bench I saw. And as soon as I sat there, boom, that's when everything changed.
So what happened?
I think I had, a couple of Indian ladies come up with a white lady the Indian lady started talking and translating everything that white lady was saying. So basically they were asking me questions. If I was homeless, do I know where my parents are? Am I a runaway? And they said, well, if you would like to come with us, we would give you 3 meals a day, and you might get adopted to Canada, America, Finland, Germany. And I'm like, okay.
The offer of 3 meals a day from these women, how different was that to what you'd been experiencing?
Meals on the streets are not guaranteed. These meals were guaranteed. Listen, I went into an orphanage in a compound that had fruit trees. I can pick fruits off the tree and eat it. And I didn't have that luxury in the streets of India, in the city. You know, I didn't know where my next meal was coming. I knew I had to beg for money. I knew I had to steal if I didn't get the money. And, you know, I took the money that I begged for. It went for food.
So when you were in the orphanage and you didn't have to worry about food anymore and, you know, just the basic survival every day, how much did your life change and how did you find it there?
It was different, most definitely, because I had other kids to hang out with, and there was a lot of them. All I remember was I was sick as a dog. I had scabies all over my lower body, and I was skinny as a pencil.
Your purpose every day had been just getting enough food to survive, to make it through the day. What became your new purpose, would you say, when you were in the orphanage?
I think genuinely I had a life that somebody cared for me. When I saw everybody getting up in the morning and having breakfast, getting changed, being bathed, and going to school and learning English, you know, it was a different routine for me. I think I liked it. And I start, you know, realizing, wow, they did say Canada. I think that was the mindset. Stay there, get better. And I was liking it. I was enjoying it.
You mentioned Canada. So who was Sandra Simpson and what role did she play at the orphanage?
She built orphanages around the world. Any place that had civil war, we're talking Cambodia, El Salvador, Somalia, she would be there. And she came in and all the kids ran up to her. And I just looked at her and go, why is everybody running? Then I realized one of the people that worked there, they said, this is your mommy. She's the one who takes care of you guys. And she was a mommy, and everybody knew it. That's when I start realizing, well, if she's everybody's mommy, she's mine as well. And she's from Canada. And the fact that my mommy is from Canada, that made me go, okay, well, if she's from Canada, I want to go to Canada. And that's when I started something that no kid ever did. So I went up to her and I pulled her skirt. I pulled her skirt and I looked up and I said, Mommy, Canada, Canada. And she looked down at me and she went, oh, yeah. And she tapped my head. Of course, of course. And then that was it. And she left. And I think she came to the compound probably twice a year, if not more. I kept on doing the same thing. Every time she came, I kept on pulling her skirt, saying, Mommy, Canada, Canada, looking up at her. One day, we did what we always do. We get up, have breakfast, and go to school. And at lunchtime, at 12 o'clock, we'd come back to the compound because the school's over. It's only half day. We came back from the school and had lunch and took our daily nap. And that's when I got woken up. And I got woken up by one of the workers saying, get up, you're going to Canada. And my eyes just lit up. And they said, get up, we have to get you dressed. Somebody's here to pick you up.
What are your memories of actually arriving in Canada?
There was a snow blizzard, and I never seen snow in my life. And it was just covered. It must have been like 6 centimeters of snow. My dad, my soon-to-be dad, Lloyd Simpson, he was waiting at the airport with a couple of my siblings. And again, I was a skinny kid. He had a winter jacket for me. He said, you're going to need this. And he put it on and, winter wonderland.
Mm-hmm. You didn't have any second thoughts when you saw the snow?
Oh, I knew I was cold. They gave me a jacket, they gave me a hat, gloves, and it was like nothing but snow covered everywhere. And then came to the house. It was this big mansion. When I got in, I counted probably about 10 kids sitting and watching TV. And I never seen a TV in my life. And I was like, oh my God. And I just sat on the bench. And I guess my mom was watching me. And finally I got introduced to the family.
So can you tell me about how many children it was that Sandra, your mum, adopted, and also about how it was that they all came to live in this house?
So when I got adopted, there was like about 24 kids, in the house. And I found out that those 24 kids were my brothers and sisters. And they were Chinese, they were Korean, they were Cambodian, they were Bengali, they were Indian, they were Vietnamese, they were white. So I had this whole globe under this one roof. She took kids that other people didn't really want because they didn't have time for a kid has some sort of a disability or whatever the reason was. She just took them because they needed a home. And they were my brothers and sisters. They were my new brothers and sisters. Going from the streets of having nobody and going to the orphanage, living with 400 kids, and then being adopted and having 24 kids as your brothers and sisters. These are your brothers and sisters for life. And it was amazing. I was very happy.
And your new siblings, I mean, they ranged from toddlers to teenagers. I mean, it sounds like it could be really quite fun being in a house with so many people. What would an average day look like, if there was such a thing?
Well, let's put it this way. I had such a big family. We had our own hockey team. We can make our own hockey team. We can make our own football team. We can make our own baseball team. It was great, man. We didn't really have to leave the house to find people to play with. We had our own gang. So it would be crazy. I don't know how my mom did it to this day.
And what about meal times?
Oh my God, meal times it was almost reminded me of the orphanage. The only difference was it was a touch smaller scale. My mom did all the cooking, breakfast, lunch, dinners. I think my mom would put like 3 jars of peanut butter and jam on the counter, and that would be your kind of snacks. If you're hungry, go make a peanut butter sandwich or toast with butter. I think in due time, the kids got older, including myself, and we took over the cooking aspects of it. And I did spaghetti on Wednesday nights. I'd cook 2 massive pots, a couple of pots of spaghetti sauce. I'm such a big fan of spaghetti, I'd like to have seconds. So I would make sure I cooked so much that there were seconds.
Did you enjoy it, the process of creating food for everyone?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it was a different lifestyle for me, right? I mean, now I'm cooking, for my brothers and sisters. And I just didn't want my mom to do anything. I want us to do things for her, take the weight off her. And I think that's where the cooking part came in with my family, everybody taking turns. So she doesn't have to do it, right? Because she's done so much for us.
Did living with so many siblings who had a similar experience of being adopted from another country, do you think that made it easier for you to make the transition from India to Canada?
I think so. I mean, eventually I embraced it a lot. But I think being in the streets of India taught me a lot, how independent I was. I was 10, 11 years old. I had like 3 newspaper routes. I've always worked. A lot of kids would spend time playing video games. With me, it was totally different. It's all about working, to this day.
You say that you were so desperate to work, you really wanted to work. Did you know what you wanted to do?
Not a clue. All I knew is that I wanted to make sure that I never begged again. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to work. Where it was, it didn't matter.
You did then really start to hone in, to focus on one of the nicest restaurants in town, that you would determine that you wanted to work there. Why was that?
I was looking through the ads and, saw the name. I saw North 44, hiring. And when I told my sister, she said, "Oh, that's a fancy restaurant, Sash." I said, "Well, I'm going to go apply." And she said, "Oh, okay." Unfortunately, they didn't want to hire me.
But I mean, from hearing about all of your experiences so far, you did not take no for an answer. What did you do?
I remember the first day I went to this restaurant, and I was waiting down the stairs, and all the cooks were coming downstairs, like one after another, and looking at me. And they just thought, who's this idiot coming for a job? And then they said, the chef said, "Sorry, you're underqualified." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He goes, "Well, you see all the chefs in the kitchen?" I said, "Yes." "Well, they went to school. They went to cooking school. And you haven't gone to cooking school." I said, I'm really a hard worker. If you give me a chance, I can prove it to you. He goes, I'm sorry.
So how did you convince them?
So I went back the next day and I pleaded with them. He said no. So I left. And at this point, I was very frustrated. I said, I can't believe they saw me twice and they still said no. So what can I do? So I had a plan. I said, you know what? I can't wait to go to bed because I'm going to get up the next day. I'm going to go back. And I'm going to guarantee I'm going to get this job. So I went back the third time. And he looked at me and goes, you again? Didn't we already have this conversation? You're underqualified. There's no job for you here. And I said, well, I would like to make a deal with you. He goes, you want to make a deal with us? I said, well, you keep telling me that I'm underqualified. And I told you, I acknowledged it. I know I am. But I want to learn. What if I told you I'd work for you for 3 months free? So, I'm having this conversation with a chef of a 5-star restaurant. And he must be thinking, this guy's an idiot. Sure, I'll take the free labor. And he took the free labor. He was right. I was underqualified for fine dining. But I wasn't underqualified for hard work. And you tell me to do anything, I will do it. I peeled bags of onions, peeled potatoes like crazy. Oh my God, the hardest job they would give me. And I would be the first one to get in. I would be the last one to leave. I would set up my station. Then I would go to somebody else's station and go, hey, I'm done. Can I help you with your station? Oh, sure. I'll help them. But guess what? I was learning that station, helping them. Then I would move to another station. Hey, I'm finished helping them. Can I help you with anything? Yeah. Do this, do that. Okay. So I kept on doing that every day. And as weeks passed, next thing you know, I can cook on every station. I didn't know what an exotic mushroom was, what risotto was. I didn't know what a concentrated chicken stock was, how you can make sauce, and how do you make a hollandaise. I didn't know any of that stuff. But you know what? In due time, I learned it.
Tell me about some of the more elaborate dishes you were cooking.
Anywhere from Cornish hens to foie gras to gnocchi, making these elaborate salads. It's like, to me, a salad was leaves on a plate. Now, we're making elevated salad that looks so beautiful. And it's like, it's just, composing a plate.
Obviously, this was an incredibly nice, expensive restaurant for quite wealthy people, I would imagine. Were there ever any moments that you would stop and reflect on that here you were sort of creating this foie gras, and you'd remember those days that you would struggle to even get any food in your day when you were back in India?
Listen, it's no secret how I feel, how I am here, and what I think about it all the time. And that's one of the reasons, I take food to the homeless once a week. No, but I don't think you want to forget where you're from. And I don't want to. I think this is exactly what I wanted. And I want to take care of people. And eating out of a garbage can, and to having what I have now, it's unreal, man.
When do you think it was that you started to think about wanting to open your own restaurant?
Well, probably, I'm 50 now. Probably when I was like 40.
So it was a decade later that you did eventually open up your restaurant. That first night of service, when it was your restaurant, when people were coming in, how was that for you?
Nobody knows this, but I actually have what I have now, tears. This is my restaurant. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. Not that I couldn't believe it, I couldn't do it. It's just I couldn't believe it, I've done it. Who would have given a chance? A street kid, a beggar.
And what were you serving up on that first night?
The menu had everything. It was very global. Had some Indian, had Japanese, had, Italian. You name it, it had it. I think I brought out my Indian dish, Madras curry with the Chilean sea bass. Had vegetable pakoras, okra, coconut milk. There's so many dishes on that menu that I'm proud of.
So tell me about the day that your mum came to the restaurant.
We both took out each other's hand, and I took her to the front of the restaurant near the windows, away from everybody, and I kind of told her, I said, Mom, thank you for bringing me to Canada. You made the right decision. And she looked at me and she gave me a pat on my head. And I knew she was very proud of what I've done. But I told her I couldn't have done this without her. And I told her I could never pay you back what you've done.
You know how you started cooking because it was you wanting to help out your mum in the house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why do you think it is you cook now?
I think I grew a passion for cooking, and I had a knack for it, but I didn't know it was going to bring me this. And I still have passion for it. I still get up early in the morning, and it's not because it's my restaurant, and no, because this is what I do. I'm a cook.
What do you think it is about cooking? I mean, that process of serving up food to other people.
Oh, I love it. You know, it relaxes me. If I'm not in the kitchen, I'm very antsy. Ever since I've been in Canada, majority of my time has been spent in the kitchen. You know, either cooking at home when I was a kid with my mom, with my sisters and my brothers, to getting older and working at a restaurant, being a busboy, working in the dish room and working in the kitchen. I've always been that, you know. I think that's in my blood right now, and it always will be.
What was the opening date of the restaurant?
My official launch date was May 30th, 2019.
2019. So you had less than a year. How aware were you at the beginning of last year of coronavirus, of COVID-19?
When we launched the restaurant, I never thought about shutting the restaurant down for a pandemic. I didn't think a pandemic was going to come through, but when you hear rumbling about it and it came about, man, oh man, you know, I put all my eggs in one basket. So my son was born 3 days before I launched the restaurant. So there's so much going on, let alone I even bought a house. May 1st, bought the house. May 27th, I had my second son. And May 30th, I launched the restaurant. Everything was going so good, and then boom.
How do you reflect on that timing, that for so many people who've worked so hard towards achieving their goals, and then something happens that is totally out of their control? How do you reflect on that for yourself?
Well, I feel because I personally been through so much, and to finally hold a prize in my hand, it might be taken away in a month. I might lose it. It's tough, man. It's tough.
If you've had like a really, really, really rough day and you're feeling really awful, is there something that you will, say, cook for yourself that would cheer you up?
Yeah. A bowl of spaghetti and a bottle of red wine.
Still the spaghetti, but with red wine this time.
Oh, everybody always asks, oh, what do you cook at home when you go home? Listen, I'm very simple, man. You know, I don't need to cook a fancy lunch at home. If I have peanut butter and jam, like I did when I grew up, that's what I'm having. And I grew up having Chinese noodles, the packaged Chinese noodles. You know what? I have it once. Now that the pandemic has happened, I had Chinese noodles twice a week for lunch. And it reminds me of me being home with all my sisters and my brothers when we were kids having Chinese noodles. And I still have it with my kid.
Something that does strike me is that we're talking now and you are actually in your restaurant and your wife is there and your sons are there and one of your sons doing homeschooling. And there is something that seems quite familiar to how you described your home when you were growing up, and that there are always people coming in and out and there are children. And how much of your life now do you think is modelled on your upbringing?
Everything that I've been through, everything that came with it, is still with me in a different scale. And now that I have, you know, kids running around the house, and, you know, it's reflecting how my parents were with their kids when I grew up in that house. Now I have it. It's you know, I don't want it to change. I want it to keep it going with whatever that brings it to new sightings for me. I mean, anything can happen.
Sash Simpson speaking to me from his restaurant, also called Sash, in Toronto. This is Outlook. We're back with the story of the spacewalk that went very wrong in just a moment. Stay with us.
This is the BBC World Service, where our new series is examining how global warming is changing life in the Arctic Circle.
As the ice melts, new opportunities are drawing the outside world further in.
What we are seeing now, everybody looks to what they consider empty areas.
I'm Alan Little, and in this new series I'll be exploring the future of mining for natural resources, of tourism, and how geopolitical tension is rising in the region.
We are increasing our presence because the Russians are increasing their presence.
In the first episode, I'll explore the impact climate change is having on the 4 million people who live there.
Snow melting early in the spring.
The avalanche hit and it destroyed 11 houses and it killed 2 people.
Permafrost thawing.
This building could collapse at any time.
Yeah, the Arctic will kill you in a heartbeat.
The New Arctic, Wednesday at 9:20 GMT.
Picture this. Astronaut Luca Parmitano is floating in space when he realizes his spacesuit is filling up with water. He makes it back to the International Space Station, but things aren't looking good.
The whole crew, they were all inside the airlock, and they were terribly worried because I wasn't moving. I think that for a few terrible moments, they thought that maybe I'd passed out or maybe I was dead.
Luca's story after the news.
BBC News with Gareth Barlow. The US President Joe Biden has threatened to take action against the Burmese military after it seized power in a coup that's seen the detention of civilian leaders, including Aung San Suu Kyi. Mr. Biden called on Myanmar's military to relinquish power immediately, or the US would take what he called appropriate action. The UN Security Council is planning to hold an emergency meeting on Tuesday to discuss the coup. In Myanmar itself, troops are on the streets of the capital Naypyidaw and the biggest city Yangon. A curfew has been put into place. A military-run TV station has announced the appointment of new ministers to replace those ousted from power. The head of the UN Refugee Agency has described the situation in Ethiopia's Tigray region as extremely grave and has urged the government to stop restricting access for humanitarian agencies. Filippo Grandi was speaking after visiting a camp where he said Eritrean refugees had complained about incidents of rape. There's mounting evidence that all sides in the conflict have been committing human rights abuses against civilians. The United States has warned that Iran could be only weeks away from having enough material to make a nuclear bomb. Iran lifted restraints on its atomic program after Donald Trump pulled out of an international nuclear agreement with Iran. The Biden administration has indicated that it's ready to negotiate a return to the accord. Kosovo has become the latest Muslim country to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. It's also recognised Jerusalem as Israel's capital, putting it at odds with the rest of the Islamic world. And Twitter has blocked dozens of accounts in India in response to a legal notice filed by the Indian government. The blocked accounts are linked to farmers' leaders and supporters of the continuing farmers' protests against agricultural reform laws posed by the government in Delhi. BBC News.
Hello, I'm Emily Webb, and you're tuned to Outlook, bringing you incredible true life stories from around the world and now outer space. What happens when a spacewalk goes wrong? It sounds like a scene from a sci-fi movie, but Italian astronaut Luca Parmitano has lived it. In 2013, Luca spent 5 months on board the International Space Station, and one of his duties was to perform essential repairs to the station. That meant getting donned up in his spacesuit and braving the outside with fellow astronaut Chris Cassidy. But for Luca, floating in space was one of the perks of the job.
Space is a magical place, in fact. When you think of one of the most popular stories for children and young adults, Peter Pan. What is so magical about him? He can fly without wings. He can fly just using his thoughts or his imagination or his magic. Space lets us do that. It lets us fly and float without wings in this weightlessness and effortless environment. And so it is like having pixie dust all over us. So what I love about space, what I loved and I miss every day and I'm looking forward to experiencing again, is that full life in orbit, living, becoming a spaceman.
T-minus 15 seconds, the second umbilical tower is now separating. 10 seconds, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And liftoff. Liftoff of Kara Nyberg, Fyodor Yushikin, and Luca Parmitano on a 6-hour ride to the International Space Station.
So in 2013, from May to November, I was part of Expedition 3637 on the International Space Station. Part of the tasks that we as astronauts perform once we are on the space station is to do spacewalks, extravehicular activities, or EVAs as we call them in the space environment. EVAs are necessary because sometimes there are instruments or structures that need to be reconfigured that are outside the space station. We need to send astronauts outside the space station wearing the spacesuits. So on the day of the spacewalk, July 16th, 2013, and my second EVA, our task was to run some cables from one side of the space station to the other.
Relay check on Lucas complete.
Okay, copy. Once you kind of get the thermal cover closed, looks like you're doing that now. Luca, you can head to the nadir routes on Node 1 and go up to the PMA2 cover bag.
On my way.
So about 45 minutes into the spacewalk, Chris and I were about done with the first task. I was jammed with my spacesuit inside a tight corner that is created by 3 different modules of the space station. Imagine 3 cylinders at 90 degrees from each other, and I was wedged in the spaces left between these 3 modules. And I was testing whether it was possible to work, to perform operations wedging that space with your suit. And I was done with that task. I had gone inside as much as I could, and as I leaned back to kind of push myself out, my head moved a little bit backwards inside the helmet, and that's when I felt some water inside the spacesuit. And I know immediately that's not normal. Immediately I called the ground, and to my credit, I have to say I did not say, Houston, we have a problem, which would have been the epic thing to do, but I didn't. I just called the Capcom, the capsule communicator in mission control. His name is Shane, and he's an astronaut.
And Chris and Shane, FYI, I feel a lot of water on the back of my head.
Hey, Luca, can you clarify, is it increasing or not increasing?
It's hard to tell, but it feels like a lot of water.
That is really not a standard call. We don't have a standard call for that because it had never happened before. And so that started a long discussion on the ground. In my head, I was mostly annoyed. I was thinking, I really hope they don't send me back inside. I really hope they don't interrupt my spacewalk. This is, there are a lot of people that are counting on me finishing my job, performing my duties, and this is probably something silly that can be solved while I'm outside, and I really don't want to go back inside. And at the same time, I was thinking, although, if the water goes inside my ears and inside the microphones inside in the comm cap, maybe I won't be able to hear from one side of the ear. It's going to be annoying, just like when you take a shower and some water goes inside the ear and you cannot hear anything for a while. So I had all sorts of different thoughts going through my head. None of them were, I'm in danger. Since Chris had finished his task, he actually came over. He translated. He used the path that we have on the outside of the space station, the handles, to come over to where I was and kind of give a look inside my helmet to see what he could see. He couldn't really see at the beginning the water because my comm cap was absorbing most of it. And the only reason why I could feel it so well is because I shaved my head, so I could feel it on my skin on the top of my head, but Chris could not see it, and neither could I. But about 20 minutes into this back and forth with ground, the water actually reached my forehead. Water in orbit doesn't flow. Water just accumulates in like a sphere. It's like a blob of gelatin staying in one place and kind of growing and growing. And it was staying attached to my skin and to my com cap. And when finally Chris saw the water accumulating on my forehead, he mentioned it. He's like, I can see it now.
I see decent sweat. No, it's not sweat. No, it's not sweat.
At that point, ground understood that there was more water than they thought initially. And that's when they called to terminate the spacewalk.
All right, Chris and Luca, just for you guys, we think we're going to terminate EVA case for EV2. So, Luca, we'll have you head back to the airlock. Chris, we'll get a for you to clean things up here and then join him here in a minute.
The nature of the leak was not completely understood. And so I didn't want to do anything without inputs from the ground because I didn't want to make the situation worse. And the ground could not give me any help because, again, they also didn't really know what was happening at the time. I told Chris, I'll see you back at the airlock. And when I started going back to the airlock, I was on my own. If you were to look at the space station, you would see that it's a three-dimensional structure. And on the outside as well, we have antennas, we have equipment, we have experiments, and a lot of these are called no-touch zones. And they're called like that because you really don't want to touch them with a spacesuit, either because you may damage the equipment itself, or because there are cutting edges that could do damage to the spacesuit, which would be a terrible accident. I had to change the orientation of my body in order to navigate a complex passage of my route back to the airlock. And as I was doing this motion to go upside down, relatively to the Earth, the sun went down. It was an orbital sunset. Orbital sunrises and sunsets are not at all like the ones on the Earth. A sunset on orbit only lasts a few seconds between light and darkness. One moment there is light and you can see where you are, and the next there is absolute darkness, total blackness engulfing you, and you don't see anything at all. And at the same moment, the water covered my eyes and then traveled down. As soon as the water found my nostrils, it just went up and completely covered my nose. So it was a pretty uncomfortable situation because all at once I couldn't see anything because not only was dark outside, but I had water covering my eyes. I couldn't breathe through my nose, and I felt isolated. And when I tried to tell Chris and ground that I was having trouble finding my way, they couldn't hear me, and I could not hear them either. I think maybe I could hear them very faintly, but they could not hear me. Certainly, at a certain level of subconsciousness, I was afraid. But the difference between being a trained astronaut and being a layman is that we are trained to, in a way, control that fear or use that fear and divert it somewhere else. I understood that I had to work my way to a solution, and instead of focusing on the problem, which was, okay, I'm isolated, I can't see, I can't hear, they cannot hear me, and I may drown with the next gulp of air, I started thinking about solutions. So the first solution would have been to just wait there, because at one point, once Chris got to the airlock and didn't find me, he would have come to look for me. But the problem with that solution was that I didn't know how much longer I had before the water filled the helmet. The volume in the helmet is not a lot. If I lean forward a few centimeters, my nose will touch the visor. And I do have a big Italian nose, but we don't have a lot of volume inside the helmet. So at this point, I am disoriented. I feel really isolated, and I don't know how to find my way back because I cannot see. The spacesuit came to help in a way. We have a safety tether which is this steel cable that we anchor to the space station so that in case we get lost in space, we can find our way back. In weightlessness, you can actually feel it. You can feel it tugging a little bit. So I knew that the anchor of the safety tether was right next to the airlock because I had attached it myself on the way out. I sensed that tug and I started feeling with my hands for the different handrails. I was trying to feel with my gloved hand the shape of the handrail so that I could solidly hold on to it and then translate and then look again with my hand and find the next one and go back. So using that force that I felt on the side, the little tug, and using the handrails, I was able to slowly translate back to the airlock.
I hear you weak but readable, Luca. Can you tell me where... I can barely speak you. I'm opening the airlock cover.
Copy, thermal cover open.
Okay, I'm in. Roger that.
And once I got there, everything got a lot better because we leave the light on inside the airlock. So once I opened the thermal cover, I could see inside. I knew how to position myself inside the airlock. The whole crew, they were all inside the airlock waiting for me to go back inside. And they were terribly worried, especially during the time it took to repressurize the airlock because I wasn't moving. They couldn't hear me. I was talking, telling them, that I was fine, that what was going on, but in my microphones, they were saturated with water, and so nobody could hear me. I think that for a few terrible moments, they thought that maybe I had passed out or maybe I was dead. But then Chris, he moved around inside the very tiny airlock. He managed to kind of twist himself so that he could see me, and he squeezed my glove, and I squeezed the glove back in the universal, message, I'm okay. And that's what he told the ground. He said, Luca is miserable, but he's okay. He looks miserable, but he's okay. So everybody, I think, took a little breath there of a relief. But when they opened the airlock, I could see the faces of my crewmates. They were terribly tense and worried. And so as soon as they could get my helmet off my face, they did that. And then they were ready with towels and trying to mop all the water, which was significant. They calculated about 1.5 liters of water. When I think about that experience and what happened to me, it hasn't really changed my approach to spaceflight or to spacewalking. And maybe it's because I'm a little denser than most people, but I would say that it's mostly because of my training and my background. So my background is in the Italian Air Force. I was a fighter pilot and turned test pilot. And I've had close calls in the flying business as well. And I always thought that it's just part of what we do. When you fly to space and you perform a spacewalk, it is understood that there are risks connected to it. And our engineers are incredibly good at making those activities look simple. But the truth is that at this point in space, we are not at a stage where we are colonizing it. We are still pioneers. We are still experimenting. We are still looking for solutions, which includes risks. And I think that sometimes in the outside world, people forget that. And we shouldn't forget that. It's better to remember.
Luca Parmitano speaking to Outlook in 2015. And in a surprising twist, that isn't the last we're going to hear from Luca this week. Because he'll be back on Outlook tomorrow telling us about his latest big adventure in space.
Somebody calls me and says, hey, Luca, what would you think of learning how to use a DJ console and then doing a DJ set from space? And at that